how many people were reaching out, providing feedback, saying what they hoped this bill would include, what they hoped that it wouldn't include, and many more, in fact, wanted to provide input. Now, the minister talks about how they heard from 300,000 Canadians, and that's great. I certainly know, and I forwarded the consultation information to many constituents that were curious about this when those consultations were taking place. However, I find it very, very interesting because I know, in fact, in many cases, I had constituents that forwarded the information that they sent to the minister on the consultation. They also forwarded it to me. And I am afraid, Madam Speaker, certainly from the perspective of those in Battle River Crowfoot that also reached out to me, that this legislation does not address the diversity of views that exist. Now, I could go on to, on this particular subject, but I think that it is troubling further the definite nature to which the government has rushed this legislation through. Now, notwithstanding the proroguing of Parliament, which is a subject that I myself have litigated in this chamber prior to this point, and certainly I know we'll hear, I'm sure, a lot more about that, especially as we enter into what I think will cut off my question and comments time with the fall economic update. However, the fact that this legislation is being rushed through, there were many further witnesses that I know would have provided a valuable input to the discussion regarding this bill in committee. There was a whole series of amendments, and quite frankly, I think many good amendments. In fact, the two amendments that are being considered at report stage, I think, deserve valid consideration. Two amendments that I think are eminently reasonable to ensure that there are safeguards put in place so that ultimately Canadians are protected. I myself sat in on the Justice Committee for a short time and listened in on more of the debate, and there is much more that should have been said. So in typical Liberal fashion, I find it troubling that they seem to have manufactured a level of urgency. They prorogue Parliament. This had been introduced in the last Parliament. They prorogue Parliament and then say, well, it has to be done, and there's only a short time frame in order to do it, or else there will be significant consequences. It's that manufactured urgency that does not lead to the best public policy outcomes, and it is incumbent upon all parliamentarians. In fact, I find it interesting that the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader was just with one of my other conservative colleagues asked the question about how long we plan to drag this out. Well, I think that it's concerning that in a question as important as life and death, including life and death for the most vulnerable among us, that the government would think that that is an opportunity to rush something through, to rush legislation through. Madam Speaker, it is incredibly concerning that they would deal with what seems to be such flagrant disregard for the diversity of perspectives that exist. Now, I see that my time is quickly coming to an end, but there is no question that as I have read this bill carefully, as I said before, followed the committee proceedings very, very carefully, that we need to ensure that the most vulnerable among us are protected. I listened carefully to a press conference that included some disability advocates, professionals from Indigenous communities in our country, addressing specifically the direction that this bill was taking. And it is incredibly concerning that it seems that those perspectives were not heard in the Liberals forcing through this legislation. The fact in a community where there is already a suicide epidemic, that this government is pushing through something that goes directly contrary to the value of life that these Indigenous folks were talking about. And I think that it is incredibly concerning that those issues are not being addressed effectively. We've heard from healthcare professionals that say the lack of safeguards provide an opportunity for this to be abused. And there is nothing more final than death. Madam Speaker. And it is absolutely essential that we get this right. You know, when I was speaking with a friend as I was walking to this to the Justice Committee when I was going to sit in for a time, I was chatting on the cell phone with a friend, and he said, "What are you debating today?" And I said, medical assistance in dying. And we talked a little bit about that. And what I find very, very interesting was a statement that he shared back at me. He said, isn't it something that you're literally going to debate something like life and death? Madam Speaker, we all need to take incredibly seriously this information that's put before us. Now, I did want to touch very briefly, and I know my time is evaporating quickly, about how it seems that this legislation fails to acknowledge and almost create two classes of Canadians, specifically when it comes to protections and safeguards that need to be in place regarding those Canadians that have disabilities. And Madam Speaker, I am absolutely thrilled to have many folks in my life with a wide range of disabilities. I have a young man who comes into my office that has a disability and is an absolute joy. He volunteers. He loves to come in and help his member of parliament. And he calls himself my special campaign manager, an incredible, valued part of my constituency. I have classmates who have disabilities, many perspectives across this country, and the unintended consequences, I trust the unintended consequences of this bill being rushed through with wording it's ambiguous and could have significant consequences in the way that we approach a subject as important as this, leads to the fact that those who are most vulnerable within our society may feel the most significant consequences by not having appropriate safeguards in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, I see that my time is coming to a conclusion, and I know that there are very pressing subjects to discuss further, so I would just finish by saying this. Let us all take seriously what I would suggest is one of the most important aspects of our job as parliamentarians, and that is to ensure that Canadians are protected, that Canadians can live with dignity. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I will be unable to support this bill, and would encourage members carefully to consider that as we go forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I'm afraid we're out of time for debate on C7 today, but when we continue debate on C7, the honourable member will have 5 minutes of questions and answers coming to him, or questions and comments coming to him. It being 4 p.m., pursuant to order made Wednesday, November 25th, 2020, I now invite the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to make a statement. L'Honourable Vice-Premier Ministre.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to table, in both official languages, the government's fall economic statement, supporting Canadians and fighting COVID-19. À l'heure actuelle,
COVID-19 is surging across Canada right now. We know the winter ahead will be hard. For far too many families, it will be a winter of loneliness and grief. But we also know that spring will follow winter. The message I would like to share with Canadians today is that we will get through this. We are a resilient people. We are a resourceful people, and we have a plan. We know what we must do to get through the dark months ahead. and we know what we must do to bring our economy roaring back once this pandemic is beaten. Mr. Speaker, every life lost to COVID-19 is one life too many. So we need to redouble our public health efforts until the virus is crushed. We do not have the luxury of fatigue. And we now have arrows in our quiver.
Prepared today than we were last spring. Canadians and Canadian businesses now have access to a comprehensive package of federal support measures to help them weather shutdowns ordered by public health authorities. We know how to keep most of our economy, from manufacturing to mining to jobs that can be done remotely, operating safely, even while the virus is still circulating in our communities. We have learned how to keep many of our children in school. Our ability to treat the disease has evolved. As of late November, more than 5.5 million Canadians had downloaded the COVID Alert app. We have the PPE and ventilators we need. We have learned to wear masks, to keep 2 meters apart, and to wash our hands. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, safe, effective, and plentiful vaccines are on the way. We don't know precisely when this pandemic will end, but we do know that it will end. This fall economic statement outlines the Government of Canada's measures to fight and defeat COVID-19, to support Canadians through this crisis, and to rebuild Canada's economy once the virus is beaten. We will do whatever it takes to help Canadians stay healthy, safe, and solvent. We will invest in every necessary public health measure, and we will support Canadian families and Canadian businesses in a deliberate, prudent, and effective way. Nous savons que les Canadiens.
We understand the sacrifices that have been made and are still being made by Canadians right now. Many small business owners have shut their doors. Workers are still without jobs. Parents have put careers on hold to keep their families healthy and safe. Young children diligently wear masks for hours every day in school, knowing they are helping to protect their grandparents. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are doing their part. It's only right that we, in this House, do ours by ensuring the economy that comes after this pandemic is more innovative, inclusive, and resilient than the one that preceded it. From the onset of COVID-19, our government has done everything in our power to combat the virus and mitigate its harm using every tool available.
8 out of every $10 spent in Canada to fight the virus and support Canadians has been spent by the federal government. To date, the government has procured more than 2 billion pieces of PPE, and we have assembled a comprehensive, world-leading portfolio of vaccines. The government has invested more than $1 billion in vaccine agreements, securing a domestic supply of up to 429 million doses of 7 promising vaccines, more than 10 doses for every Canadian. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Canada has secured the most diverse and extensive vaccine portfolio of any country in the world. Every Canadian can rest assured that a safe and effective vaccine will be available to them free of charge. The battle against COVID-19 has proceeded on many fronts. We have invested in healthcare, increased testing and tracing, and directly supported provinces and territories as they fight the virus. This has been a Team Canada effort. L'aide totale à court
Total support so far includes $322 billion in direct measures to fight the virus and help people, and $85 billion in tax and duty deferrals. Mr. Speaker, this is the largest economic relief package for our country since the Second World War. Last spring, the Canadian Armed Forces did heroic work in our long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec, and they helped save Canadian seniors' lives. In the summer, we announced more than $4 billion so provinces and territories could build up their testing and contact tracing capacity, part of our $19.9 billion Safe Restart package. To help stop the spread of the virus in vulnerable communities, we worked with cities and communities to ensure that voluntary self-isolation sites would be available as an alternative to crowded housing. Alongside these essential health measures, we've introduced robust economic programs to help people, businesses, and organizations of all sizes to survive this pandemic together. These supports form a comprehensive safety net, which will be in place until the summer of 2021.
Emergency Response Benefit, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, and the Canada Emergency Business Account were quickly developed and rolled out so that people could pay their rent and mortgages and feed their families while doing their part to defeat the virus by staying home. From March through October, the CERB alone supported 8.9 million Canadians. Seniors received a special old age security top-up of $300, and qualifying Canadians with disabilities have received additional support worth up to $600. In August, the government announced the Canada Recovery Benefit, the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, and enhanced employment insurance. Each will be in place through the fall of 2021. This safety net is providing essential security to millions of Canadians. This month, the government launched new measures for businesses with a new commercial rent subsidy paid directly to businesses who this week will begin receiving support for up to 65% of their rent or mortgage interest, retroactive to September 27th. Businesses will also begin receiving new lockdown support of an additional 25% of rent or mortgage interest, where a shutdown is required by public health order. This means qualifying businesses in lockdown can have up to 90% of their rent covered. We are extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy through to June of 2021. More than 3.9 million Canadian jobs have been protected by this program alone. Mr. Speaker, in December, Canadian businesses will be able to apply for a top-up to the Canada Emergency Business Account Loan and Grant Program. Already, more than 780,000 small businesses across the country have taken advantage of the $40,000 CEBA loan, of which $10,000 is forgivable. The top-up is an additional $20,000 loan, of which half will be forgivable. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we know that small businesses are the heart of our communities and the engine of our economy. Small businesses are the foundation of Canada's middle class. And we know this crisis is hitting family businesses particularly hard, imperiling in a few months the work of a lifetime and often of generations. That's why it is so important to support our small businesses and the middle-class families who have built them. Mr. Speaker, these measures provide economic certainty to Canadians in a turbulent and uncertain time. They will help get us through the winter. And these measures are targeted and flexible. They are most generous to those in greatest need. They are an essential complement to our healthcare response. These measures allow people and businesses to do the right thing, knowing they don't have to choose between public health and putting food on the table. Our commitment to employee sick leave and to supporting businesses where local shutdowns are ordered are examples of this approach. With the second wave upon us with full virulence, we are taking additional measures to help Canadians and Canadian businesses get through to the other side, to get through solvent and intact. We are providing $1 billion for a safe, long-term care fund for the provinces and territories, making fresh investments in PPE, and preparing for the largest vaccination mobilization in Canada's history. We are providing new resources to help improve ventilation in our public buildings, to make them safer, and to help workers and businesses. We are raising the wage subsidy back to a maximum of 75%, recognizing that the earliest months of the year are the toughest for many businesses, and now more than ever.
Nous savons.
We know that businesses in tourism, hospitality, travel, arts, and culture have been particularly hard hit. So, we are creating a new stream of support for those businesses that need it the most. A credit availability program with 100% government-backed loan support and favorable terms for businesses that have lost revenue as people stay home to fight the spread of the virus.
This is the most severe challenge our country has faced since the Second World War. It is our most severe economic shock since the Great Depression, and our most severe public health crisis since the Spanish flu a century ago. Canadians should know that their federal government will be there to help them get through it, come what may. Today, I have spoken about the nature of the threat we face and the remedies we have provided. The fight against COVID-19 continues. But there is now light at the end of the tunnel. After winter comes spring. The seeds we have sown and will continue to plant in the weeks and months ahead to protect Canadians' health and save our jobs and businesses will help us come roaring back from the coronavirus recession. This careful husbandry will prevent the long-term economic scarring that would otherwise delay and weaken our post-pandemic recovery. Mr. Speaker, I'm the daughter of an Alberta farmer. Canada's farmers spend the winter fixing their tractors, combines, and seed drills, and stocking up on supplies. While the ground is frozen, they get ready for seeding when the earth thaws. Like all those great Canadian farmers, the work we do today will stand us in good stead in the spring. When the virus is under control and our economy is ready for new growth, we will deploy an ambitious stimulus package to jumpstart our recovery. Spending roughly 3 to 4% of GDP over 3 years, our government will make carefully judged, targeted, and meaningful investments to create jobs and boost growth. Notre plan de relance.
Our stimulus will be designed, first and foremost, to provide the fiscal support the Canadian economy needs to operate at its full capacity and to stop COVID-19 from doing long-term damage to our economic potential. Key to this plan will be smart, time-limited investments that can act fast while also making a long-run contribution to our future shared prosperity, our quality of life, our competitiveness, and our green transformation.
Will include investments that deliver on our commitment to create 1 million jobs and restore employment to pre-pandemic levels, as well as to unleash some of the Canadian economy's preloaded stimulus, the additional savings that have accumulated in the bank accounts of some Canadians and on the balance sheets of some businesses. Our growth plan will foster economic rebirth in the short term and strengthen this country's competitiveness in the long run. Today, we are presenting a down payment on this plan. These are measures we can begin safely taking now. They include investments in the green economy and job training, particularly for youth and care providers, rural broadband, airport infrastructure, rapid housing, economic empowerment for vulnerable communities, and measures to immediately build up our health and social infrastructure. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we know that Canada's future competitiveness depends on our ability to take advantage of the net zero green economy. Our growth plan must continue to advance our progress on climate action and promote a clean economy. We will plant 2 billion trees over the next 10 years, provide 700,000 grants to help homeowners make energy-efficient retrofits, and build zero-emission vehicle charging stations across the country.
Ces mesures favorisent les dépenses.
These measures will encourage consumer spending and investment while greening our economy and creating well-paying jobs.
Mr. Speaker, this is a recession like no other we have faced. Women, young people, new Canadians, Black and racialized Canadians have been disproportionately hurt by the COVID-19 recession. They are, after all, the Canadians who are most likely to work in some of our hardest hit industries, including care, hospitality, and retail. And we know that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples are also disproportionately affected by this pandemic. Our growth plan will be designed with this particular damage in mind and will seek to heal it. This unique recession demands a unique response. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated the systemic barriers faced by Black entrepreneurs and owners of small and medium-sized businesses in Canada. So, the government, in partnership with Canadian financial institutions, has announced an investment of up to $221 million, including up to $93 million from the Government of Canada over the next 4 years, to launch this country's first Black entrepreneurship program. There is an unacceptable gap in infrastructure in Indigenous communities. So our government proposes to invest $1.5 billion beginning in 2020-2021 to speed up the lifting of all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nation communities. COVID-19 has been especially hard for young children and their families. We know that many middle-class families are really struggling. So to provide immediate relief for families with young children, our government proposes to introduce temporary additional support totaling up to $1,200 in 2021 for each child under the age of 6 for low and middle income families who are entitled to the Canada Child Benefit. Mr. Speaker, we know that COVID-19 is rolling back many of the gains Canadian women have fought for and won in my lifetime. That is why today, as part of our commitment to an action plan for women in the economy, we are laying the foundation for a Canada-wide early learning and child care system. Just as Saskatchewan once showed Canada the way on healthcare, and British Columbia showed Canada the way on pollution pricing, Quebec can show us all the way on childcare. I say this both as a working mother and as a finance minister. Canada will not be truly competitive until all Canadian women have access to the affordable childcare we need to support our participation in our country's workforce. Bravo. C'est un programme.
This is a feminist agenda, Mr. Speaker, and I say that proudly. It's also an agenda that makes sound business sense and is supported by many of Canada's corporate leaders, people who have witnessed firsthand the toll this crisis has taken on women, their families, and their children. We can only all do better when every one of us is contributing to our full potential.
As we build back, we have it within our reach to build back better. Tackling challenges that hold us all back: homelessness, systemic racism, the unfinished and essential work of reconciliation. Economic downturns are always especially hard on young people. The COVID-19 recession is particularly damaging in this regard because of its impact on the service sector, in which many students work. Among other steps, the government proposes to reduce student debt by eliminating interest on the federal portion of the Canada Student Loans and Canada Apprentice Loans for 2021-2022. I remember vividly struggling with my own student loans, and I am glad to help relieve our young people who are swimming so hard against the COVID-19 current of this additional burden. In the coming months, we will work with Canadians and consult broadly to design the growth plan that will guide our recovery and set our course for the years to come. Mr. Speaker, our country entered this crisis in a strong fiscal position, allowing our government to take decisive action to help people and businesses weather the storm. And that action has helped so much. To date, Canada has recovered almost 80% of the more than 3 million jobs lost at the outset of the pandemic. Compare that to the United States, which has recovered just over half. But there is still a lot of hard slogging ahead. First, we must defeat the virus. Only then, when the threat of lockdowns and resurgence is past, will our economy be ready for a return to full, stable, long-term growth. Canadians understand that this crisis demands targeted, time-limited support to keep people and businesses afloat and to build our way out of the COVID-19 recession. The support and investments outlined in this plan, including our stimulus, will foster a resilient and inclusive recovery. Fiscal guardrails will help us establish when the stimulus will be wound down. The government will track progress against several related indicators, recognizing that no one data point is a perfect representation of the health of the economy. These indicators include the employment rate, total hours worked, and the level of unemployment in the economy. These data-driven triggers will tell us when the job of building back from the COVID-19 recession is accomplished, and we can bring one-off stimulus spending to an end. When the economy has recovered, the time-limited stimulus will be withdrawn, and Canada will resume its long-standing, prudent, and responsible fiscal path based on a long-term fiscal anchor, which we will outline when the economy is more stable. Mais ne vous trompez pas.
But make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, as we've learned from previous recessions, the risk of providing too little support now outweighs that of providing too much. We will not repeat the mistakes of the years following the Great Recession of 2008. In this fall economic statement, we are being transparent about the continuing uncertainty. We are planning and preparing for all eventualities. The rate of infection, the severity of shutdowns, the deployment of a safe and effective vaccine, all of these are variables in our economic outlook and our path to recovery.
La reprise. Mais, comme le montre,
but as our fiscal plan shows, Mr. Speaker, brighter days are ahead, and we can afford the investment we have to make to reach them. Canada entered this pandemic with the strongest fiscal position of any G7 country. We retain that position today. Federal debt servicing costs relative to the size of our economy remain at a 100-year low. And we are locking in those low costs by issuing more debt into longer-term instruments at these historically low rates.
Les Canadiens veulent un système.
Canadians want a fair tax system where everyone pays their fair share, so the government has the resources it needs to invest in people and keep our economy strong. That is why we're moving ahead with implementing GST, HST on multinational web giants. And we are also limiting stock option deductions in the largest companies. And, if necessary, Canada will act unilaterally to apply a tax on large multinational digital corporations so that they pay their fair share just like any other company operating in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, our growth plan is far-reaching and transformative. But does this mean that the worst of the COVID-19 crisis is past? Sadly, it does not. Indeed, our country's most difficult days may come in the weeks and months immediately ahead. Hospitalizations are on the rise, and the virus continues to take a terrible toll, particularly on our elders. That is why we must redouble our public health efforts, obey public health instructions, physically distance, wear masks when in public, avoid social gatherings, and wash our hands. We must all do this, Mr. Speaker. We can save lives. Canadians can and should avail themselves of the federal programs now available. We are here. This safety net is there now so that people can make the right decisions to protect our health. If we do the right things, if we hunker down and heed public health advice for these last remaining months, we will also be doing the right thing for our economy. And we will bring closer the day when every Canadian can get back to normal life. Most importantly, we will greatly lessen the mortal toll of this disease. Mr. Speaker, after nearly 10 months of the pandemic, we are all tired. But we also know that vaccines and a better day are coming. To get to that day, we must first help each other get through the winter. Our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through hard winters too. In times of war and depression, on frozen prairie homesteads, and in wind-swept fishing villages in Atlantic Canada, all across our vast country. The living survivors of those days, now our most vulnerable elders, are counting on us to buckle down for another few months. We can do this, Mr. Speaker. We must do this, Mr. Speaker. And we will do this, Mr. Speaker. Canadians have faced tough winters before, and we have always emerged stronger. We will this time, too. Thank you. Merci.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians want their lives back, and they were expecting they'd hear news today that the government had fixed its failures that mean that Canada will be the back of the pack to receive the pandemic relief in the form of a vaccine that will give them their lives back. With the highest unemployment, other than Italy and all of the G7, they were expecting a plan for paychecks. Instead, they got a plan for more credit card debts. $400 billion will be added to our national credit card this year, 8 times bigger than the previous all-time national average. While Conservatives supported the CERB, the small business loans, the wage subsidies, those account for less than half of that record-smashing deficit. In fact, we've gone from a debt to GDP ratio of 30% to 56%. Now, within view of the default levels that we hit in the 1990s when Liberals were forced to slash health care to deal with the massive debt crisis that existed at that time. We are not at the cliff or even on the edge of the cliff, but we can now see the cliff, and this government is running towards it as quickly as humanly possible. The biggest deficit by far in all of the G20. They've spent the most to achieve the least. With all that spending, we're going to be the back of the pack on vaccinations. We have the second highest unemployment in the G7, and we couldn't get rapid testing approved and timed to get Canadians safely back to their lives. The minister has said that she would impose, quote, limits on our debt to avoid the brutal constraints of the marketplace. Will she tell us today, when speaking of the debt, what exactly are those limits? Thank you.
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite touched on a lot of issues, ranging from vaccines to support on businesses to debt, deficits, and fiscal anchors. So I'm going to try to touch on most of those. Let me start with vaccines, Mr. Speaker, and let me say something that it is very important for Canadians to appreciate, because this is a key element in building the confidence we all need to have in our economic recovery. Canada has the most expansive portfolio of vaccines of any country in the world. 10 doses for every Canadian. And Mr. Speaker, we have, like a smart farmer, a smart investor, hedged our bets. There are 7 different vaccines in our portfolio. 4 of those vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson, are already submitting data on a rolling basis to Health Canada regulators. That, Mr. Speaker, can, should, and will provide a great deal of confidence to Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, let me quote Moderna's chairman, who, by the way, came to Canada first as a refugee child. He said that Canada is near the front of the line to receive 20 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna. And I'm quoting him. The people who are willing to move early on with even less proof of the efficacy have assured the amount of supply they were willing to sign up to. In the case of Canada, that number is about 20 million doses. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. 20 million doses of a single vaccine. And there are 38 million Canadians. Now, I'm going to continue quoting Nubar Afeyan. He says, the government of Canada, like others, has also reserved the ability to increase that amount, and those discussions are ongoing. So, Mr. Speaker, and this is very important in terms of building the essential confidence in each other and in our economy. We have an extensive vaccine portfolio, and this is going to make a world of difference. Mr. Speaker, let me just speak briefly about the issue of debt and deficits, and I'll say 2 things. It's important for Canadians to appreciate that the interest charges on our debt that we are paying right now are the lowest in a century, and the government is acting prudently to push out the maturity of that debt so that we can lock in today's low interest rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
L'honorable député de la...
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID crisis is a health crisis. Healthcare is a provincial responsibility. It's Quebec's responsibility. Provinces have been hit so hard by this crisis. In fact, in Quebec, we need $3 billion more to deal with this health crisis. The federal government has cut health transfers year after year after year. Currently, we need 22% in order to help provinces. Provinces and Quebec have asked for over $20 billion to get the federal government to 35%. And that's without taking COVID into account. In this economic statement, we hear a plan for economic recovery and yet nothing for health transfers. This is the number one thing that Quebec and the provinces want. The government is ignoring what the provinces are experiencing and what they want. That's my first point. Second point, well, if you want a recovery plan, first and foremost, you need a vaccination plan. We're told that many vaccines have been bought. Yes, that's great. The government was panicking and they went and bought vaccines left, right, and center. Well, that wasn't really the best way to go about it. We need a plan with details, with dates, with numbers. How many doses will we receive? Who will be vaccinated first? Which provinces will be considered priority provinces due to the situation of COVID and contagiousness in those provinces? What parameters and indicators will be used to vaccinate and to deploy vaccines to the provinces, to Quebec? We haven't heard anything. We have no details. Mr. Speaker, the government is not being serious. Why is the government not taking tangible, real action to prepare a vaccination plan for Quebecers and Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. First, I would like to cover the federal government's assistance and support to provinces and territories, which is historic. Through our Safe Restart Agreement, we set aside $19.9 billion for provinces and territories. We added a further $2 billion for the safe restart of our schools. We are continuing to invest with the $1 billion I invested today for safe long-term care, for ventilation in public buildings, for PPE. We are here for provinces and territories. We are here for Canadians. And I would like to add something. I hope my colleague will hear me. We are here for all Quebecers. We are here for Quebec's businesses. 8 in every $10 spent on crisis management since the beginning of the crisis have been spent by the federal government. 25% of Quebecers have received, in fact, the CERB. So many Quebecers were helped by our benefits. We have saved lives, we have saved families, and we continue to help through the wage subsidy. We know that the winter will be difficult. That's why we decided to increase the emergency wage subsidy back up to 75% as the maximum amount. That's substantial, Mr. Speaker. Now, as for vaccines, Quebecers should be proud of Mr. Noubar Afayette. He is a Quebecer. His family still lives in Quebec. Canada welcomes refugees with open arms, and that is why the world has that vaccine. That's what we heard on Radio Canada yesterday. He said countries who are ready to act quickly without full proof of efficacy are able to ensure for their countries several doses, securing doses. And it's so true, Mr. Speaker. We will have 20 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have 1 minute for a final question, 30 seconds for a question, and 30 seconds for an answer.
Minister Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep a roof over their head. But when they read the economic update, what they will see is austerity is coming, Mr. Speaker. Now, we know during this pandemic so far, we've seen $53 billion wealth going to Canada's billionaires. But in this document, we see no wealth tax, we see no excess profits tax. The web giants are not obliged to pay $1 of corporate tax. So for the pandemic and for the rebuilding, the question is very simple. Why does this government continue to refuse to have Canada's billionaires pay their fair share?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister in 30 seconds or less, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm accustomed in this House to facing many accusations, but I didn't expect to be accused of a policy of austerity this afternoon. When it comes to taxing the web giants, let me say this. We are clear on our intent to levy the GST, HST equally on all service providers in Canada. That's fair, and I know Canadians believe in fairness, and we also made very clear that while we much prefer working inside the OECD to have a multilateral approach to taxing corporate revenues of multinationals, if that job is not done, Canada will act unilaterally, and in January 2022, we will impose our own tax because that is fair too.
Outstanding. Resuming debate, reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has proven their government has no plan. Without a plan for vaccines, there can be no long-term plan for our economy. Without rapid testing in wide distribution, we've missed out on a critical medium-term tool, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Finance, in her speech, seems to realize that she's putting the economy on hold. She'll say, we'll rebuild the economy once COVID is beaten. Well, Mr. Speaker, rapid tests could help preserve the economy, and the vaccine will help us beat it. This government is late and has no plan for both. That's right. Canadians should see that off the start. This year has been a very difficult year for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We all know that. 2020 will be remembered as the year a global pandemic came to our shores and took this government completely by surprise, despite many departments warning them for months. It will be remembered as a year of foreclosures, rising unemployment, and uncertainty. Worse, for 12,000 Canadian families, it will be remembered as a year of grief and tragedy. Cette année a été difficile.
This year has been difficult for all, for younger Canadians and older Canadians. We will remember 2020 as the year that a pandemic took this government completely by surprise. A year of foreclosures, rising unemployment, and worse, a year of grief for the nearly 12,000 families who have lost a loved one. Canadians have shown courage. Canadians have followed public health directives and supported small business. Canadians have been there for their friends and families.
Canadians have shown courage and fortitude. They've respected directives from our health authorities. But Canadians are hurting. Canadians want their lives back. And this fall economic statement shows that they cannot rely on the Liberal government to get their lives back. Canadians are not difficult people, Mr. Speaker. They have complied, followed rules, they've tightened their belts. They're reassuring their worried children and taking care of aged parents. And to this effect, I'm really glad the Liberal government and the minister took my proposal from this spring on support for parents by boosting the Canada Child Benefit. There it was on page 10 of my leadership platform, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so glad the Liberal cabinet was reading it just as hundreds of thousands of Conservative members were.
Hear, hear.
Yes, I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, because this was a concrete proposal to help families, especially moms, working moms, juggling it all, helping families through the toughest time in our modern history. But we know that Canadians need more. As I said, Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker, and they've only asked one thing from this government, one simple thing. What is the plan, Mr. Speaker? For widespread use of rapid tests, what is the plan for rolling out the vaccine? When does it arrive? Who gets it first? Do we have the freezers for the -70 vaccine, Mr. Speaker? A robust portfolio in 2023 doesn't help us as we enter 2021. Well, Mr. Speaker, this fall economic statement answers the question on whether there is a plan. And it answers that no, there is not. And as the red ink on our balance sheet turns a dark crimson, we're facing a $399 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker, not $400 billion. No. It's a bit like 1999. You're not spending $20, Mr. Speaker. It's only $399 billion, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians know that not even half of that went to the emergency programs. This government is not providing a plan, they're not providing clarity, and it's clear, having been late on rapid tests on the border, there's no clarity or competence. Où est le plan, monsieur?
Where is the plan, Mr. Speaker? Millions of Canadians have been forgotten, left behind by the Liberals. The only thing that the government has to offer them, though, is more debt, less jobs, no vaccines, no clarity. Why did it take months for us to get rapid tests? Why don't all Canadians have access to rapid tests? When will we receive vaccines? Who will be vaccinated first? Today's announcements clearly demonstrate that the government is improvising. Canadians are tired of the government's incompetence and of their always delayed reactions.
Statement is another disappointment. Is that all they've got to say to the thousands of unemployed workers left behind by mismanagement of this government? Is that all they have to offer to Chris Rigas, owner of the old Fire Hall restaurant in Niagara, who is struggling to get by because of restrictions? How does this statement help Rodney and Tina Grace, who've been working 7 days a week to keep their Best Western open in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia? 30% of the businesses in Surrey, British Columbia still don't qualify for the wage subsidy because of red tape and rules from this government. But most of their staff qualify for the CERB benefit. So guess which decision businesses are faced with? If this government spent half as much time meeting with real Canadians, small business owners, than they spend on photo ops, they would know that workers, small business owners, are asking for clarity. Canadians in a pandemic aren't asking them to ban single-use plastics. They're asking for details on when the vaccine gets here, how it's being distributed, how it's being preserved at -70. How can they save their aging parents from a senior's home or a hospital bed. This Prime Minister needs to get his priorities straight. But it's hard to take this government seriously when we know how this all started, Mr. Speaker. Think about how much better off Canada would have been if the Liberals had not shut down the pandemic early warning system. They did that in 2019, Mr. Speaker, without any consultation with scientists or with opposition parties in Parliament. Canada, for 20 years, had the world's leading pandemic early warning detection unit. It had helped stem the advance of H1N1, Mr. Speaker, of Ebola in other parts of the world. Canadians were helping protect others. But this government's incompetence led to that department not helping Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
Shame.
You heard that right. This government preferred to shut that down and rely on open source data from China, rather than intelligence work gathered by Canadian experts. As a result, we had zero warning of the incoming pandemic. In many ways, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government took the batteries out of our smoke detector. Le gouvernement libéral.
The Liberal government closed our borders 2 months too late. They also flip-flopped on the risks of contagion in person and on mask wearing. The Conservatives, though, have been good team players, Mr. Speaker. We tried to work with the government as much as we could. We tried to improve the government's erratic action. Most importantly, the Conservatives have been there for workers who really needed our help. We voted for emergency legislation, and we voted for programs to help workers. But the Prime Minister's leadership, his idea of leadership, is to tell Canadians to collect the CERB rather than to help workers keep their jobs. You really have to live in an ivory tower to think that that's what Canadians really want. Canadians want to go to work, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to sit home waiting for government checks.
This economic response has been erratic and confused at every step. Do you wonder why the Liberal government underspent on their own estimates for the wage subsidy by tens of billions of dollars while overspending on the CERB by tens of millions of dollars? They didn't have a plan to preserve the economy amid the storm of the pandemic. Millions more Canadians were put on the CERB than necessary when their jobs could have been maintained easily through an effective and swift wage subsidy. Cette approche illustre parfaitement la différence entre.
This approach illustrates perfectly the difference between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. The Liberals believe that Ottawa has all the answers and must give orders. We believe that the best solutions come when Ottawa works in partnership with people on the ground. A partner, not a paternalistic one, as with the Prime Minister. But if only the Liberals had a clear plan. What we're hearing today is a panicked government burning money to hide its incompetence. This is unacceptable. Canadians deserve better.
Mr. Speaker, in both the military and in business, I know you have to learn from setbacks and failures. We must strive for excellence in what we do and promote an approach of continuous improvement. Teams do that, businesses do that, charities do that. Why does the Liberal government not do that? They haven't even learned from what they got wrong or slow in the first wave of the pandemic. We were last in line on rapid tests, Mr. Speaker, and now we're virtually last in line for vaccines. Countries with population of about 2.7 billion will be seeing the vaccine before Canadians, many this year, and we can't even get answers from this government on whether we have the logistics to receive it. The job of government in a crisis is to provide certainty, confidence in citizens that are worried, Mr. Speaker. We must provide a plan, clarity, stability, competence for those who rely on us. The upheaval we're seeing in our country lately and is in large part because of the misguided measures of this government. Late on the border, late with programs, late with rapid tests, and now late with vaccines. While the Prime Minister prefers to compare himself to the worst student in the class when it comes to the spread of COVID-19, I want Canada to strive to be the best, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians expect. Unfortunately, we are far from that right now. After the ongoing rapid test debacle, and this week, Canadians are learning, even today, the Minister, in response to her speech, won't let us know which month next year vaccines will first start arriving. Our government had the duty to learn from its errors in the first wave, but instead of that, it's failed to provide vaccine for Canadians. At the same time, we'll be seeing vaccines roll out with all our allies. The Prime Minister has played the victim card. He said his government was helpless, that Canada didn't have the capability to manufacture vaccines. Now, not only is that complete rubbish, in the words of a leading scientist at the University of Ottawa, it's complete political spin, Mr. Speaker. And it also doesn't explain, well, why millions of people from Indonesia to Brazil will be receiving the vaccine before Canada will be. Again, the truth is the Liberal government was slow to respond, and they made a critical, and in sadly some cases fatal error, to put all their eggs in a basket with China, Mr. Speaker. And since the CanSino deal fell apart in August, this government has been scrambling to catch up, and they don't want anyone to know that they're months behind other countries. As I said earlier, countries with 2.7 billion people will be served before Canada. This means we're near the back of the line. While Americans are talking about mass vaccination throughout all of January, our government is only speculating about getting part of our population vaccinated by September. That means 10 extra months, Mr. Speaker, of health risks for Canadians, business closures, and economic uncertainty. Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health talks a great deal about the whole of government effort and the robust portfolio, but there's only one way to describe the performance of this government when it comes to vaccines: incompetent, Mr. Speaker. Canadians, in the midst of the second wave, would rather have one dose of the vaccine in the next month than the largest portfolio 18 months from now, Mr. Speaker. Ce gouvernement libéral n'inspire pas confiance.
This Liberal government does not inspire confidence. Let's talk about its purchase of $370 million for medical gowns paid to a company with almost zero experience, or their $237 million respirator contract to their friend Frank Baylis. The We Charity scandal revealed Liberal friends who are trying to profit during a pandemic, and at a time when the trust of citizens is so important. The Liberals continue to use their donor list to choose future judges. It's one scandal after another, Mr. Speaker. Uncertainty, lack of focus, huge expenses, special treatment for their friends, and disconnection from the reality of Canadians. Those are the only ways to describe this government. But the damage is real. There are millions of people who have lost confidence and who know they've been forgotten.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian economy was already showing serious signs of weakness before the pandemic hit. Ignoring our warnings, the Liberals took pride in running large structural deficits and raising taxes in good economic times. Ideological policies opposed by the entire country, like Bill C-69, tanker bans, pipeline cancellations, bad trade deals, and the inability to negotiate tariff avoidance has resulted in $160 billion leaving Canada before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Within 2 weeks of one another, a great Canadian company, Teck, cancelled a $60 billion project for our GDP out west, and the world's most famous investor, Warren Buffett, pulled out billions from a project in the east. There were already signs being sent by this Prime Minister that Canada was not open to job creation or investment. At a time we need it, Mr. Speaker, it will take a change in government to change that sign for the world, Mr. Speaker. In British Columbia, we've seen half a dozen sawmills close, and our aluminum smelter in Kitimat, one of the greenest operations in the world of its kind, they were left out to dry in both NAFTA and aluminum tariffs. Canada was already at a crossroads under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, before the pandemic, and they are setting this country up to, for the first time in our history, pass on to our children a country with less opportunity and more division, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I want to prove it. The middle-class values that myself and many of our colleagues were raised with, Mr. Speaker, mine in Bowmanville, Ontario, taught me to work hard, help my neighbors, and strive to be the best I could be. I was taught to learn from setbacks, never accept failure, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get better. This led me to serve 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces alongside some of the most exceptional Canadian citizens around. It also led me to respect the value of hard work and perseverance and the nobility in work itself, Mr. Speaker. My first job was as a dishwasher and a short order cook, Mr. Speaker, in high school. And my last job before the military was with TransCanada, inspecting pipelines, back at a time before this government when that company was still proud to have Canada in its name, Mr. Speaker. I respect people, my colleagues do, that work hard to provide for their family, whether they're a uniformed and unionized plant worker or an entrepreneur, whether they work the night shift in Mississauga, Ontario, or get up at 5 a.m. to open their small business in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. There's a nobility in that act of discipline, perseverance, and working hard for your family. We cannot lose that in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight hard to ensure that we never lose touch with that fundamental value upon which Canadian society has been built. Je crois que c'est mon devoir.
I believe it is my duty to be a partner for the provinces and First Nations. I want to be a champion for small business and nonprofit organizations. I believe in the immense potential of our Canadian energy, our lumber, and our minerals. We produce the most ethical and environmentally friendly energy in the world. And we want greater engagement with First Nations to develop that energy. Reconciliation must be more than just talk, Mr. Speaker. It's not just about looking at the mistakes of the past. It's about having a real plan for the future. A plan that brings lasting pride and wealth to communities that are too often forgotten. The James Bay Cree and the Huron-Wendat in Quebec are an example for all of Canada.
This country working again, Mr. Speaker. Hard work emboldens the soul and builds a nation. Hard work helps families. Those families build communities and make us proud to be Canadian. Just think of Jacqueline and Barbara's 7 rooms home decor and gifts in Ocean Park, British Columbia. They bought the store just before COVID, Mr. Speaker. It's been extra tough for businesses like that. But Jacqueline and Barbara persevered, worked harder, rebranded, and they recently reopened. Congratulations, Jacqueline and Barbara. That is the Canadian spirit. They don't want more debt saddling the next generation. They just want an opportunity. They could have packed it in, but they didn't. They stayed open, they adapted, they persevered. When I questioned the Minister of Finance in the House on behalf of energy workers in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, she boasted about how many people she'd put on the CERB in that province. Albertans especially, but Canadians don't want the CERB, Mr. Speaker. They want the ability to get their lives back and to get back to work. They want a government that helps them build their livelihood in their communities rather than pushing them to close shop and move away. Because this is what it comes down to, a clash of vision between the somewheres and the anywheres, Mr. Speaker. Those who love their trade, their pursuit, and are loyal to local businesses versus those who the government wants to flock to a trendy job that is in no way connected to the community or the betterment of our country. And while this Prime Minister seems to think that every Canadian can simply work on their laptop from the local cafe, Mr. Speaker, that's not reality, nor is it what Canadians want. Conservatives are here to fight for those who build things in Canada, those who get their hands dirty and take pride in doing a job well before they come home for the night. And whether they're pulling the resources out of the ground in Canada or pulling resources out of their brain educated in Canada, we need to applaud and help them do that, Mr. Speaker. That's why we were hoping for a plan for rapid tests, for vaccine. Unlike this finance minister, I don't want the economy to crash and be rebuilt after the pandemic. I want to save it and make sure it's stronger after the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. So we are here, Mr. Speaker, for the manufacturers, the aluminum and steel industry, the small business owner, the first-generation Canadian that started a business and now hire and employ 7 other families. We're here for the farmers and the commercial fishermen, Mr. Speaker. We're here for the Indigenous entrepreneur, the working mom and dad juggling childcare and the ability to get on the GO train to go into work in the city. We're here for those Canadians that want their lives back, that want the ability to work hard and want the ability to pass on to their children a Canada that is limitless in its potential, Mr. Speaker. And they deserve a government with a vision like that, not a government that is late at every step in the worst year in our modern history. That's right. Les travailleurs canadiens méritent.
Canadian workers deserve a government that fights for them, a government that is not obsessed with transitioning our industries in the midst of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker, a government that is patriotic and not afraid to fight on the world stage for rapid access to vaccines, a government that knows that Canada has an identity, a history, and that we can be proud of this.
And the rebuilding from it will take grit. It will take determination, perseverance, bold decision, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will take a plan to chart our course forward. That's why it's so disappointing. After a record period without a budget, there's a stealth budget introduced today with no plan, Mr. Speaker. COVID has set us back, but COVID will not stop us. With the right ideas, with principled, ethical leaders who understand the value of a job, whether it's your first job out of school, Mr. Speaker, or your last job before retirement. With a government that will put the prosperity of all Canadians ahead of the special interests of a select few. If we have a government like this, Mr. Speaker, Canada will emerge from COVID-19 stronger, richer, and more determined than ever before. That's my mission. That's the mission of my colleagues with me here today, Mr. Speaker, and that must be our country's mission. And that's why I'm so disappointed with the Finance Minister's update today. There's no vision. There is no expression of values, including the value inherent in working Canadians. And the lack of a plan to address the most critical issues facing our country in one of the most challenging years in our country's history will only fuel the fears and uncertainties facing Canadian families across this great country. Mr. Speaker, now is not the time for experiments. Now is the time for experience. Now is not the time for building back with slogans. Now is the time we show we have our citizens' backs, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
We need to have a plan for the challenges we face today so that our children will have the same opportunities we did tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Leader of the Official Opposition started off by talking what will Canada be remembered by, or the government be remembered by, in 2020. And I believe what the Canadians are going to remember is that a year of a crisis, of a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, that the Government of Canada stepped up in a very real and tangible way and worked with the provinces and territories, Indigenous leaders, the very many organizations, nonprofits, private sector, so many individuals, Mr. Speaker, with the one possible exception of the official opposition, at least in most times, and came together and recognized that we needed to minimize the negative impact of the coronavirus. And by that working together, we were able to make a difference. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Leader of the Official Opposition: does he not agree that it is the efforts by working together collaboratively that Canada has been very successful to date and will continue to be going forward, because we have the right approach in terms of combating the negative impacts of the coronavirus?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Liberal Deputy House Leader. The only collaboration I saw in the remarks today, Mr. Speaker, was the fact that the Finance Minister did adopt the child care plan I advanced last spring, Mr. Speaker. In the spirit of Team Canada, I was a little upset she didn't thank me for the suggestions, Mr. Speaker. But if it's good for Canadian families, I'm happy with that knowledge alone. But he started off by saying, what will Canadians remember the most politically amidst the pandemic? I think on this side of the House, what we will remember most, and what a lot of Canadians will remember most and be most disappointed with, that even in a pandemic with no parliamentary oversight, there was one special line for Liberal insiders and one other line for all other Canadians. There was the We Charity scandal that they prorogued the House and have had a cover-up of historic proportions rather than answer reasonable questions about, and sole source contracts for a former Liberal MP colleague of theirs whose seat was hardly cold from having sat in this House before he got untendered contracts that the government has tried to mislead Canadians about, saying it's with another company, even though the name of the respirator is the Frank Baylis respirator. So I think that's one of the disappointing things I'll remember, rather than the Team Canada, where some of us even offered to sit on an all-party pandemic response team. There was one line for Liberal insiders and one line for all Canadians. On this side, we're going to fight for all Canadians.
Comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Official Opposition made a number of suggestions and concessions to the government about what it
should do, what it has done and should do in the future. I'd like to hear what he has to say about something the Bloc has proposed to reduce the deficit potentially, and that is to cut all subsidies and tax credits for fossil fuels. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Pour la question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. We are here on behalf of all Canadians and all Quebecers, Mr. Speaker. I am proud of our work in the regions of Quebec, in the Saguenay, in Abitibi. I'm proud of our natural resources, some of the most environmentally responsible in the world, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, in the midst of a pandemic, it's time for jobs for all Quebecers and the creation of wealth, Mr. Speaker, opportunities for all. I talked about that at my meeting with Premier Legault. I want to be a partner with the National Assembly, not a paternalist like the Prime Minister. And it's time for Quebecers to examine the Conservative Party, to take another look at us, because we are here for the benefit of all Canadians. We are here to protect French in Montreal and all across the country. We are prepared to be the next government, Mr. Speaker, and Quebecers deserve better. Questions and comments?
The member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the member is a student of history. He knows through the previous crises we've had strict laws against excess profits, strict laws against profiteering. And yet, in this pandemic, Canada's billionaires have added to their wealth by the tune of over $53 billion so far. Now, the papers that the government has distributed today indicate that what they intend to do eventually is to withdraw supports from people. But the PBO has said there's two alternatives. One is withdrawing supports, the other is increasing revenues. And yet, in this document, there's no wealth tax, there's no excess profits tax. The web giants who have made billions of dollars through this pandemic are not obliged to pay $1 of corporate tax. Would the member agree with us that what needs to happen is this government needs to take a strong stand against excess profits and put in place on the revenue side the kinds of things that would make a difference so that people can get the supports that they so desperately need?
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know my friend from New Westminster, Burnaby, is addressing questions to the Leader of the Conservative Party. I'm the wrong person to suggest we need to raise taxes to, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we need to probably provide some relief to small businesses, seniors who are struggling. The problem is, then, that member finds it every day in question period. There are 4 parties on the extreme left of the political spectrum in Canada right now. His declining party, the Liberal government, the Green Party, and the Bloc, all on the far left. There's only one party in the center-right. Union members in his riding. Take a look at the only party that supports building things in Canada, supports getting our energy and our resources to market, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to some of the corporate excesses, Mr. Speaker, I've been calling out that too, but I prefer caveat emptor, Mr. Speaker. Buyer beware. We should look at what grocery chains are squeezing suppliers when that's one of the only sectors that have seen record profits amid a pandemic. I think Canadians want to support small local businesses. Suppliers that respect local farmers, local producers, aren't squeezing them, Mr. Speaker. So we don't apply big government, but we will call out, particularly in a time of crisis, what we think is not appropriate corporate conduct. And I'm very proud of our Shadow Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. After her efforts, we suddenly see this government respond, both on the grocery issue and my colleagues from across Quebec on the compensation for our farmers, Mr. Speaker, promised years ago and held up. So not only are we opposing as the official opposition, Mr. Speaker, we're proposing to get Canada back on track and build our country back stronger.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. I know that he says that he supports climate action and dealing with the climate emergency that we all voted that we were in last year. And I'd like to ask him about the proposal that the Liberals have. It's straight out of the Green Party documents about creating a national energy grid to tie the provinces together, and noting that there was a geyser that they hit for geothermal in Saskatchewan that could put lots of former oil drillers to work, transferring their skills as we work through a just transition and make sure that those workers have good paying jobs as we work towards the energy future and leave the fossil era behind. And I just wonder what he thinks about this proposal that the Liberals have put forward, and what his ideas are in terms of clean, green energy in this country.
The Honourable Leader in the Opposition in 1 minute or less, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, I actually arranged a call with the Prime Minister so I could talk about working with the incoming administration on projects, getting Keystone done, being proud of energy independence between Canada and the U.S., also looking at ways we can work together, build our economies stronger. Now, there were 2 reports issued by the Prime Minister's office of that call, Mr. Speaker. The second one is the accurate one. The first one went out before the call took place. But what I will say to that member, Mr. Speaker, is I'm proud of what we produce here in Canada. The myths that energy is going to change in the next century, you're going to see a diminishment, but the free world should be using resources from the only exporting country that has transparency, that has human rights adherence, that has environmental measures to reduce carbon intensity, that partners with First Nations. We are the environmental, social governance leaders of the world with our energy and resources, and we should promote and be very proud of that, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, l'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by saying that we've heard some pretty good ones here in the House today. Since the last election, there's been no budget. It's been over a year, no budget yet. And in the economic statement today, they're announcing there'll be a budget next spring. Well, we're looking forward to seeing that. We've been asking for a budget for a long time. There was a summer update that was just a snapshot of what the spending has been so far, how big the deficit is, and how much is forecast. That was a useful document, but it lacked any kind of vision or alignment, any connection to anything else. And today, in this statement, we thought, well, we're finally going to see what we're expecting. We're going to get what we want, because a budget is an important point in any parliament, ideally once a year, with an update in the fall in the interim. But we have a government now that's putting Canadians deeper into debt than ever before in the past, but they didn't present any kind of a budget document today. We had high hopes for this document today, but unfortunately, like the document says itself, we've got lots of good ideas, but wait until the spring to see what we're actually doing. So it's a bit disappointing. There were 2 things that were of fundamental importance to the bloc. We had a bunch of requests. They're not that complicated. We want We've gone out and seen families and businesses and groups. Our consultations reveal that people need this and they need that. These are their problems, and we present those here. And then we want to represent those people. We want to convey those individuals and companies' needs to the government. And if there's any consensus in Quebec, it's around funding for health care. And that's not just unique to Quebec. I think that's all across the country. In the throne speech, there was a consensus among all provinces that healthcare needs to be better funded. And we're in the middle of a pandemic here. It's a public health crisis. And what does this document say? not a penny for health, or basically. Yeah, that's...
Je veux rappeler à tout le monde, everyone in the chamber, that there is a presentation being made. Someone is speaking. I just want us to respect that person, and we all want to hear what the honourable member for Joliette has to say. On veut tous entendre.
We'd all like to hear what the honourable member for Joliette has to say. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was starting to be difficult to communicate here in the House with the leader of the official opposition having a full-on conversation with one of his members. So, Mr. Speaker, it happens pretty often here in the House. When you speak French, there are a lot of people here who are unilingual Anglophones, and they just can't be bothered to listen to the interpretation. And they say, well, we don't understand it, so we'll have our own side conversations at the same time. And like the Minister for Global Affairs said, that's a lack of respect. And I thank him for his sympathy. So as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, the top priority for us is, after consulting all of our constituents, the top priority is fund healthcare. Quebec is at the very forefront of this call for better funding for healthcare. We need to catch up. We're at less than 20% of the money coming from the federal government. We'd like to see it be a little bit more than a third of the healthcare funding coming from the federal government. I think that's $28 billion more that we expect from the federal government. The reason the pandemic has hit so hard in our long-term care facilities and elsewhere is because our system was already weakened. And the question was asked recently to the Chief Medical Health Officer of Canada, and she replied, yes, indeed, the system was already weakened. And how was it weakened? It was weakened because not enough money had been invested in recent decades. That funding, or chronic underfunding, if you will, is directly attributable to the federal government's withdrawal from funding. A few decades ago, they were paying for footing basically half the bill, and then over the years it has gone down to 40%, and by the end of the 90s, Canada managed to balance its books by absolutely slashing healthcare funding, healthcare transfers. And the province have been stuck ever since, footing the bill. So whenever a dollar is paid in federal taxes, the provinces expect at least half of that should come back into healthcare. That's a consensus among provincial premiers. There's not a line about it in the throne speech and not a line about it in this document here, in this statement. What this document says is that we've had all these programs for the pandemic, and 80% of the money is coming from the federal government. Well, hats off to you. The money is here. And why is all the money here? It's because it's the provinces are stuck paying for the health care. Ottawa should be doing its fair share, but they copped out. And now they're sitting on pots of money here in Ottawa and leaving the provinces to struggle with rising costs. So we're saying the feds should step up and chip in at least a third of the cost of healthcare. And the federal government said that they were going to earmark $1 billion for long-term care, but there are going to be strings attached. There's going to be conditions, and if you meet our conditions, then we will forward the money. So you're going to have to prove that you that you respected your plans. Frankly, whose jurisdiction are we talking about here? And this is taxpayer money. It's their money, and let's respect jurisdictions. What is Ottawa doing, meddling with the way the provinces run healthcare in the field with our nurses and our personal support workers and so on? Where's the expertise? Where does it lie? It lies in the provinces, with us in the provinces. The provinces know what to do. If Ottawa were responsible for healthcare, then we simply wouldn't have public healthcare. They wouldn't be able to manage it. And now the federal government, too, is trying to rattle on about standards and impose standards on all us. They're going to try to centralize healthcare using standards. We're going to capitalize on your weaknesses. We're going to take advantage of this situation to pull the blanket onto our side and gain greater control over healthcare. That's unacceptable. It's a lack of respect, and it simply shouldn't be done. Mr. Speaker, there are also our seniors. They're the most vulnerable category among Canadians. And seniors have been left to fend for themselves. They've been left out. The price, all their costs are going up for housing and groceries and so on. And during the election campaign, the government said they would increase OAS, but not for those from 65 to 75. In fact, they reneged on their commitment. Then they've tried to create two classes of seniors, those 65 to 75 and those over 75, by offering different benefits, different levels for the different age groups. But the pandemic has made seniors, put them in a weaker situation. Their purchasing power has gone down, and they've been completely left out here, completely forgotten. And we expected better. I'm a bit disappointed. Not just because of that. There are some good things in this document, but there's not a lot. The document says you'll have to wait until the spring, till the budget, to see what more there will be for the restart plan. But there are some little things that are worth mentioning. Taxing web giants. That's good. As of July 1st, they will have to collect sales tax. Quebec is already doing this. It's bringing revenues in, and this is good. And it takes away the unfair advantage that web giants had against Canadian-grown businesses.
Honorable député.
Point of order. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to hear what my colleague from Joliette is saying because there are other conversations going on in the House. Could members be asked to stop talking while the member is making his speech, or should we wait until they've finished talking? I think it's a lack of respect, and I'm interested in what the member for Joliette has to say. I would ask all members to whisper perhaps a little more softly. It's better than it was, but perhaps they've forgotten again. So I just ask everyone to speak a little more quietly. I know we can't get too close because of COVID-19, but if it's that important, perhaps you could leave the House for a few minutes and then come back to listen to what the honourable member for Joliette has to say. Thank you very much. The honourable member for Joliette.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we see that most MPs don't speak French, and so they don't feel like listening to the interpretation. That might be why they're chatting. So they start chatting amongst themselves or doing other work, forgetting that there is a speech being made in French in the House. This is the unfortunate situation in which we French-speaking MPs find ourselves too often in this House. So back to what I was saying, we're disappointed that there's not enough announced for vulnerable people, such as seniors. There's not enough for health. I will also come back to the Safe Restart Agreement. Now, there are some good things. As I was saying, we're happy that they'll be taxing web giants. In the economic statement, the government has committed to levy taxes like other OECD countries. And in fact, if other OECD countries don't go ahead, then the government said it will go ahead unilaterally on its own to tax web giants. As for huge multinational corporations, well, our businesses, our mom and pop businesses are suffering during the pandemic. Meanwhile, Canadians are shopping online more and more. The Amazons of this world who offer e-commerce services, they need to be on a level playing field with our small businesses. So we're happy to see that in the economic statement. Next, the environment. For a few months now, we've been told that the recovery should be a green recovery, that this is a good opportunity for the environment. The economist Jerry Rifkins, he has spoken about the Green New Deal. It sounds like a great idea. We thought there'd be some of that in this document, but no. We're told that there will be further consultations with information and details to come. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether the government is promising us future commitments, which will be in their election platform, so they'll be able to say, you can have this commitment and this promise if you vote for us. Seriously, though, Mr. Speaker, we wanted to see more measures for the environment. There is a climate emergency. It's urgent that we act. There are measures for eco-friendly retrofits. Canadians will be able to receive up to $5,000 for eco-friendly retrofits. That's positive. We support these measures. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are taking a rabbit out of a hat. The same rabbit, how do we solve environmental issues? We're going to plant 2 billion trees. Eventually, the government will plant 2 billion trees, and that way we'll meet all of our targets. They promised us that during the election campaign a year ago. How many trees have been planted thus far? 0 trees. So I put this question to the House. The 2 billion trees, how many have been planted? 0? Oh, my colleague says maybe 1 or 2 have been planted. My colleague said he himself has planted some. The government should pay the Bloc Québécois leader $1.50 to compensate him for growing trees. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, more needs to be done. We hope that in the upcoming budget there will be a serious plan for the environment. There are some nice measures here, but they are largely insufficient. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy was increased and extended. That's announced in the economic statement. The wage subsidy is being boosted, brought back up to 75%. We support that. It's important that employers be able to keep their employees on the payroll during the pandemic. It's the right thing to do. It's positive. Same goes for the commercial rent subsidy. The original program wasn't working well. The program was fixed. We voted for it. That's positive. And now, we want the government to offer sectoral support to struggling sectors. There needs to be targeted, specific support for sectors who are especially hard hit and who have unique situations and needs. We expected to hear more tonight. But no, we're told to wait for the budget. There will be information in the budget. Here is an example, Mr. Speaker. There's some text here about airlines, some measures announced for airlines, but airlines is not the same thing as airports. Last week I met with a representative of the Montreal airport. They are suffering. They are doing very poorly. They need targeted support. Airlines need help. Nothing is actually announced here. It seems like something's being announced, but no, we're actually told to wait for the budget. Well, we've been waiting quite a while for the budget. It says here the air travel industry in the document. And we're told that it's similar to the aerospace industry, but there's nothing here for the aerospace industry. Montreal is the 3rd biggest hub city after Seattle and Toulouse for aerospace. And when we see what's happening in the US and in France to support the aerospace industry, they are bending over backwards to support those industries. The aerospace industry is suffering, but that is a sector with an incredibly high value added for the economy. They do a lot of innovation. For example, our C-Series, developed in Mirabel, now it's been bought by Airbus. It's a total gem of a sector, a gem of a business. Now the small and medium businesses are suffering in that industry. They want a specific targeted sectoral support program. And they, in fact, had to bend over backwards just to have access to the emergency wage subsidy, which they didn't originally have access to. Quebec had to stand up for them because Ottawa didn't. We managed to change the rules to help them, but they need a targeted sectoral support program. We can't lose that cluster, which adds so much value added to Quebec, to our economy. It also creates so many jobs in Ontario and other provinces. In order to support the sector, there has to be a vision. There's no vision, there's no information in the statement here. Now, as for tourism, there's a little bit here for tourism, but we're told again to wait because something's coming. The same goes for live events, festivals, for example, the event industry. There's nothing for them. So many sectors need help. For example, in tourism or sugar shacks, reception rooms for events. These are very specific businesses with specific situations. They need sectoral support programs. And we're told time and time again, wait for the budget. Well, that is problematic. As I was saying earlier, the same goes for the Safe Restart Agreement. We are hearing announcements about vaccines. Here in Canada, in Quebec, we're going to see what's happening for a few weeks, a few months. We're going to be behind citizens of other countries because the government was late to act, didn't have a vision. We're hearing that other countries, neighboring countries, will be vaccinated soon. That is how you safely restart the economy. If we had vaccines ready, if we had a plan, we could say, well, with the vaccine coming, we can get back to normal life. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. Alas, there is no restart agreement based on a restart plan based on vaccines. Mr. Speaker, the government is very creative with its numbers. Here is an interesting example of that. The government on page 9 defends its vaccine strategy, saying it has the largest number of vaccine deals with companies per capita, and 15 other countries are cited, including Switzerland. Switzerland does very well because it has pharmaceutical companies. In the charts in this document, it makes it seem that Canadians have the most vaccines per capita. That's not accurate. Switzerland has a lot of headquarters of pharmaceutical companies, and they have many laboratories as well. The Liberal government is being creative with the numbers in order to show what a good job they're doing, but the real facts, the real numbers are worrisome. Dr. Caroline Quash, she has answered the question that we often ask in this House. Could Canada have produced its own vaccines? Dr. Caroline Quash has said that Canada does not have any vaccine-making capacity. In Toronto and other places, there were labs like Sanofi Pasteur labs. In Quebec, there was GSK. They have labs, but they're not manufacturing the vaccines we need. They're making vaccines for travelers, for example, or for seasonal flu. In the past few decades, in the past 15 years, in fact, In Quebec, we used to have a really strong pharmaceutical industry. We had many laboratories which would have been able to rapidly retool to produce vaccines. But unfortunately, successive governments made political choices which took away that vaccine-making capacity. During the 80s, during the Meech Agreement, Quebec worked with Ottawa and produced a lot of successful results for the pharmaceutical industry in Quebec. But after 95, Ottawa pulled out of an agreement. Quebec had to work twice as hard, but it wasn't enough for the multinationals which were in Quebec, so they shut down or they left Quebec. The effects of that became very visible in the 2000s. The year of the referendum, though, in 95, there were political decisions here in Ottawa which made the pharmaceutical industry in Quebec suffer. We have had pandemics before. There was H1N1, SARS. Some experts have said that we're lucky because the current virus is not so contagious as other viruses. We have found out that a year ago, the government closed a national stockpile center, getting rid of hospital gowns and masks, other equipment. That is very unfortunate. It is also so unfortunate in general that Ottawa let Quebec's pharmaceutical industries disappear. If that industry had been preserved and maintained, we would have domestic vaccine production capacity. Unfortunately, that is not what transpired. It is, in fact, a tragedy what happened to the pharmaceutical industry in Quebec. Now, as for the pharmaceutical industry in Ontario, which has been there a bit longer, some say it's not a very serious industry. Labs were set up starting in 1993. They were able to operate at low cost. Labs in Ontario were very successful. They were recognized around the world. For example, they made insulin for diabetes. They made the polio vaccine, a Canadian and an American doctor. They were known around the world. Then, in the 70s, with Trudeau, they privatized a lot, and that was concluded under a Mulroney government. Ontario had vaccine production capacity and expertise and was producing at low cost. In March, a Toronto Star columnist wrote a piece about this. Her name is Linda McQuaig. If we want to foster economic development, we need vision. We had strong sectors in Quebec that could have gotten us out of these economic doldrums quickly, but those sectors were not supported. Then when it came time to negotiate deals for vaccines, the government really dragged its feet. So we're behind. Maybe by 2023, we'll have some domestic production capacity. It's not enough. Hopefully, we'll learn from the mistakes of the past and avoid repeating them. We know how difficult it is when our neighbors make choices for us and we suffer the consequences. In Quebec, we had expertise. We made vaccines. We manufactured them. But unfortunately, we lost it all. When we get the vaccine, we will be late. We will get it later than other countries. In the document, there are graphs and charts showing that Canada is ahead of everyone. Well, we may not be at the front of the pack or at the back of the pack. Here's what we wanted to see, Mr. Speaker. We wanted to see more funding for healthcare. We wanted to see more money for seniors. The government has, in fact, committed to that, but that has been reneged on. We wanted to see more for recovery programs. We wanted to see sectoral support programs for aerospace and other suffering sectors. There's none of that. We're told to wait for the budget. It'll be in the budget. Well, once again, this is being punted down the road. There are some positive measures for the environment, eco-friendly retrofits, zero-emission vehicles. That's good, but doesn't go far enough. As for web giants paying taxes, we support that. We support levying taxes. There's another measure for stock options. Limited to $200,000. That's something. That's a step. Then there is the Canada Child Benefit. It is being boosted substantially. We support that. And that's all I have to say. Oh, wait, no. In fact, I found another page of notes. There is help for those who have to work at home, those who are teleworking. We support that. The emergency wage subsidy, the maximum rate has been raised back up to 75% to take into account the severity of the second wave. That's good. But we're waiting for the budget. I'm not sure we're going to have to vote on this document. There are two bills at the end of the statement. We thought that there would be a Ways and Means vote at the end of the minister's speech. And we will eventually vote and debate on these bills, which seem rather interesting. Mr. Speaker, last spring there was no budget. The government has never spent this much. That's why we need a budget. We expected so much more. We are disappointed. The deficit is also very worrisome. $381 billion. That's an astronomical amount. Unprecedented. It's a lot of money. Much of this money was put to good use, for example, supporting workers who lost their jobs. But the government must be more transparent. There was the We Charity scandal. There was a lack of transparency. Then there were liberal chums making ventilators and masks. There was an issue with the chief of staff's husband. We need more transparency. 4 committees have studied the lack of transparency, but Liberal members on each and every one of these committees really blocked transparency requests. We want a special committee to study this spending. We've been asking for this since we got back from prorogation. Nothing yet. And in fact, in committee, Liberals filibustered for dozens and dozens of hours. So we didn't get to hear from witnesses. We didn't get to fully do our work in anticipation of the next budget. We need a special committee to look into spending and to look into the deficit. Now, of course, we do have to spend during the crisis, but we need a special committee to study that spending. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my issue is more so getting onto the issue of healthcare. But before I do that, just to reaffirm that when we take a look at the vaccination issue as a whole, I really do believe that Canada is exceptionally well positioned to be able to vaccinate over in many different types of situations because of the fine work that a special group of people were able to put together, of civil servants and scientists. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, my question is related to the member's comments. On the one hand, he says we should be spending more money towards health care. Yet then on the other hand, the member is saying that the federal government shouldn't have nothing to do with health care. Now, I believe in the Canada Health Act. I think the Canada Health Act is something that ultimately ensures that as a Canadian, no matter what province I determine that I'm going to live in, that there's going to be a health care system that provides those 5 principles that are set out in the Canada Health Act. Is it the Bloc's position to get rid of the Canada Health Act?
L'honorable député de Joliette.
The member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ottawa's job in the field of health is to fund that sector. We pay our taxes. Half that money comes to Ottawa, so it's logical that Ottawa fund half of this country's health care expenses, and yet year after year, Ottawa is decreasing its share, and now the federal share stands at about 21%. What provincial premiers are asking is for Ottawa to pay 35%. That would be a step in the right direction. There was nothing in the speech from the throne in that regard, and nothing in the fiscal update. So long-term care homes, which are struggling, which cannot hire enough staff, and where we saw these terrible coronavirus outbreaks, did these long-term care homes need federal interference, or did they need money to hire personnel? Well, there are quite a few in my riding. In Saint-Eusèbe a few years ago, there was a big COVID outbreak. It was in the heart of Joliette. I didn't hear them say we need Canadian standards. Please, please bring on the standards. No, they need money. They need money to hire people. It's been decades, since the middle of the 1990s, that Ottawa has been withdrawing from the field of healthcare. It's been cutting back. Why? It doesn't seem to have the money anymore. And this causes institutions to make terrible choices, and we've seen the result of those choices. So for the Bloc and the National Assembly in Quebec's Ottawa's role is to spend and to shoulder 50% of health care costs. When it comes to the vaccine, well, I'll come back to that in 6 to 9 months, and we'll see who turned out to be right. I think that he just swallowed his party's Kool-Aid. His party seems to believe that the vaccine is coming. But when we compare Canada with other countries, it seems that, well, we don't have any production capacity anymore. We're not at the back of the line. We're not at the head of the line either. And that's because in the spring, the government waited too long to adopt a plan for the vaccination of Canadians, so things are not good as they stand right now.
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member across the aisle here on this side for his very eloquent and well thought out speech. As members of opposition parties, our desire is to scrutinize and offer suggestions to help the government perform well for all Canadians, and I appreciate the cooperation we've had together. You mentioned transparency and accountability. Could you share ways that perhaps if that was dealt with better, how Canadians would have benefited more during this crisis? Thank you.
I just want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the chair. It's wonderful when it's nice and peaceful like that, but sometimes it gets emotional and it goes back and forth and it gets out of hand. Just a reminder for all members. L'honorable député de Joliette.
The member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, first of all, thank my colleague for her question and for her positive observations. Yes, we can find solutions. We can improve projects and come up with suggestions to ultimately help people when the work is well done. But here we are with a government which is spending more than ever in Canadian history. Why? Because the situation is serious. However, what we saw in the spring, now given the seriousness of the situation, the government pulled back. It imposed closure to pass the legislation it wanted. The government asked members of parliament to simply rubber stamp what it wanted to do. It asked parliamentarians to trust it. Well, we did at the beginning, but then what happened? Well, the government, passed the wage subsidy program and dipped into it afterwards. And then we saw that friends of the family of the Prime Minister had an organization which claimed that it could run a program. We're talking about millions of dollars here. So the We Charity Buddies of the Prime Minister wanted to benefit from the pandemic. Listen, we're talking about billions of dollars here, and it's impossible to scrutinize everything, all the money being spent with the way things are being run right now. So really, the government is asking for blind trust, but it has lost the trust of parliamentarians. So we do need to implement more programs, but we have to do it more transparently. And therefore, we need a special committee to study these program expenditures. It was promised since after prorogation, but the government has done nothing to create such a special committee. It does not want to be transparent about how it is spending taxpayers' money. We go back in time and remember the sponsorship scandal. We thought the Liberal government had changed its stripes, but clearly it has not. This is unacceptable, and therefore we need a special committee to review all the money the government has spent in the interest of rebuilding trust. The member for New Westminster Burnaby. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague. I know that as a member of the Finance Committee, he knows that we have to look at government revenues. In the past, many cuts were made under the Paul Martin government. There was a lot of austerity. However, so if we don't make sure there are enough revenues, and if too much money is spent, draconian cuts are brought about. Now, we know that there are some corporations in Canada and wealthy people who don't pay their fair share of taxes. We don't have a wealth tax here in Canada. And some people, Canadians, hide their money in tax havens, and we have no way to go after that money. And this government here is managing an unfair tax system, and it is not going after billionaires, which during the pandemic saw their wealth increase by $53 billion, and yet they are not paying their fair share in taxes. What does my colleague think of that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Everything you said is very true. Many economists have said that the problem with this pandemic is that there's a K graph, a K table. The poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. So there's a downward line and an upward line. It's a lack of tax fairness. But as a society, we have to make sure that we level the playing field for everyone and that wealth is redistributed. Thomas Piketty is a French economist. He has talked about a wealth tax. And the Minister of Finance has, in the past, written a book on plutocrats, billionaires in our world who get away with whatever they want. So these are important issues we need to scrutinize, and we need to eventually redistribute wealth in a way that's more fair. Obviously, it's a complex issue, because if we increase taxes on the rich, we have to make sure that they don't move their capital elsewhere. So it's a complex matter, but we have to tackle it. Even more important, tax havens are still legal in Canada. And why? Because this government has not made them illegal. They are immoral. Take Bay Street banks. They've made record profits this year. They put those profits into tax havens. Why? So they don't pay their fair share of taxes. That's unacceptable, and it has to change. Resuming debate. The member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Mr. Speaker. No. And I'd like to start off by saying a big part of this economic update touched on things that have happened over the course of the last few months. And as you're well aware, Mr. Speaker, when this government, when we first hit the pandemic, this government certainly was willing to work with opposition parties, and the NDP stepped up. Now, you'll recall as well, Mr. Speaker, that the first action of this government during the pandemic was to offer supports to the banking sector, about $750 billion in liquidity supports from a number of different federal institutions. That was a bold move. It's not matched by any boldness to actually support regular Canadians at this stage in the pandemic. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you're well aware of what the member from Burnaby South did, and the entire NDP caucus, was step up with a series of proposals that we knew would make a difference in the lives of Canadians. Canadians have really struggled through this pandemic. They are still struggling. And we believed that there needed to be a series of measures that would make a difference in the lives of people as they struggle to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head, to keep often their small business that they have often given a life to, keep that small business operating so that we avoid that tragedy of people turning the key in the lock for the final time as they leave that small business behind. So that was the measure that we brought to this pandemic response. And this is what we proposed and forced and pushed the government to put into place. First, emergency responses. And when the government had a series of holes in the emergency response benefit, we pushed for the student serve as well. We pushed for a 75% wage subsidy. The member from Burnaby South was very eloquent in this regard. Other countries had done that, and we believed very firmly that Canada needed to put in place a 75% wage subsidy too, to make sure that businesses could continue to operate and that people could continue to work. We pushed, and through this House, as you know, Mr. Speaker, support for seniors. We pushed for a moratorium on student loans. We didn't think that students should have to pay back their loan to the federal government at a time of this pandemic. We pushed for supports for First Nations communities, and a whole number of members of our caucus were very strong, pushing the government to provide those supports. Supports as well for the people who were not receiving supports in other means. And that's why we pushed for things like the Canada Recovery Benefit. The member from Burnaby South, of course, numerous times pushed for a national sick leave, which is historic in nature because it means that people who are unfortunately not able to work because of their sickness or being concerned about catching COVID-19 could actually, for the first time, actually take that paid sick leave and not have to choose between putting food on the table or doing the right thing. That paid sick leave is historic, Mr. Speaker, and we believe that it should be made permanent as well. We provided and pushed for sectoral supports for a variety of industries, and members of this caucus, including the member for Courtenay Alberni, who is our small business critic, pushed for an emergency rent subsidy. And Mr. Speaker, this and our supports that we pushed for very strongly for people with disabilities are two areas where basically the government only did partially what needed to be done to provide those supports and make sure that those Canadians had the wherewithal to get through the pandemic. First, for the emergency rent subsidy, the government rolled out a program that was tied to a company that had ties to the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister. And the initial program that was rolled out actually was with a commercial mortgage company, and it was for landlords who held commercial mortgages. Very clearly inadequate, very clearly a very strange approach. And we continue to push, Mr. Speaker, for the second emergency rent subsidy, which is a much better program. But as you're well aware, Mr. Speaker, that program has not been retroactive for the course of the spring and the summer. And it should be, because many of the businesses who went through all those difficult periods through the spring, through the summer, and are now living these difficult periods in the fall need the wherewithal and need those supports. And we continue to press this government to make that rent subsidy the retroactive prior to the spring, so that those businesses that weren't able to benefit because the program was so complicated and actually a failed program in so many respects, that they, with this new rent subsidy program that the NDP applied pressure to bring to bear, would actually be able to benefit from it. And for people with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, I have expressed on the floor of this House my deep disappointment that while the banking sector got $750 billion within days of the pandemic, this government had to be pushed and prodded repeatedly. The member from Elmwood Transcona, the member for Hamilton Centre, and other members of the NDP caucus pressed this government repeatedly. And finally, they, after an 8-month wait, put in place supports that are partial for people with disabilities that are only registered and exist in the federal database. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt there are many other people with disabilities that need support, and the only way to do that is with the planning and forethought to make sure that those who are registered provincially for disability programs get supports. But in short, Mr. Speaker, what the NDP brought to bear was a series of measures that would make a difference for people, and we will continue to do this. Now, this is where my disappointment lies, and our disappointment with the fall economic statement, because we believe that those supports need to be continued, that there needs to be a sense that all Canadians matter and that we all come through this pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic, that we can actually put in place a very solid foundation for Canadians in the future. And yet, the government has refused to do this. With the fall economic statement, they've refused to take any of the revenue measures that have been suggested not only by the NDP, but by many forward-thinking people, thinking ahead. As the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, who is our independent officer, all Canadians can rely on his advice, said very clearly, with the fiscal situation of the country, there are only two alternatives. One is to cut those services and supports to people, otherwise known as program cuts or austerity. And Liberals may laugh at that, but they also laughed at austerity when we suggested it back in Paul Martin's day, and we know the result, Mr. Speaker. The cuts in programs have an impact even to the present day, and the ending of the National Housing Program for the justification of austerity means today there are people who remain homeless because the federal government stopped building of affordable housing that is so necessary for so many Canadians. Well, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the fine print, because with the NDP, we don't always don't only look at what is said in the sort of basic speech and the basic balance sheet of this economic statement. We also look at the details. And the summary statement of transactions clearly indicates that what the government plans to do next year is substantial cuts in program expenses. Now, many of those are program expenses that come through COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, but there is no doubt that the intention of the government is not on the revenue side to increase the revenues, to put in place supports that make our rebuilding sustainable, but instead a choice to look to ultimately wind down programs of support, and without looking to replace them with other programs that can make a difference in people's lives. Now, you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, that so far during this pandemic, Canada's billionaires have added to their wealth in the order of $53 billion. Canada's big banks, who received that massive dose of liquidity support within days of this pandemic hitting, are looking at substantially increased profits. We're going to see in the next few days, Mr. Speaker, each of the big banks release their latest quarterly profit figures, and there's no doubt that we'll see an increase, as we did in the spring and the fall, $15 billion in profits so far during this pandemic. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why 90% of Canadians support a wealth tax is because they see that discrepancy. They see that contradiction. billionaires with massive increase in wealth. Some of the web giants, massive increase in profits. Banking sector, significant profits right through this pandemic. While so many Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, so many Canadians are struggling to make ends meet, keep a roof over their head. So many small business people are struggling to keep that small business operating. They see the contradiction between the banking profits, the addition to billionaires' wealth of over $53 billion. They're well aware of the massive amounts of money we lose every year to overseas tax havens. Mr. Speaker, as you're aware, the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, again, as the independent officer of Parliament, advises all parliamentarians that we lose over $25 billion each and every year to overseas tax havens. And Mr. Speaker, of course, $25 billion, that means over the last 5 years under this government, it's been over $125 billion lost to overseas tax havens. And when we talk about the supports that Canadians need now, we see those massive amounts of money that have not been diverted to help Canadians, that rather serve to pad the bottom line of some of Canada's wealthiest people and some of Canada's most profitable corporations. We also have the web giants. And you know this, Mr. Speaker, that during this pandemic, we've seen substantial increases in profits by the web giants like Facebook and Amazon, Netflix, Google, and yet they don't pay corporate taxes in Canada. And so the measures announced today that are only talking about implications around the GST, HST, are minor compared to the impacts of not paying that corporate taxation. And, Mr. Speaker, as well as you know, we've seen significant subsidies going to oil and gas companies, and we have the government wanting to spend what could be up to $20 billion on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. This is a project that the private sector walked away from, a project that has profound implications for the climate emergency, and the government is intending to spend what the PBO will define in the next week or two, because the PBO has been asked to produce a study and asked to produce the bottom line in terms of the rapid rise in construction costs. But we're looking probably in the order of $20 billion the government wants to spend on a project that is not financially viable and basically will have a dramatically negative impact on any hope of Canada meeting its obligations to meet the climate emergency. So the question is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Why is the government priority always seems to be billionaires? Why is protecting that increase in wealth and those profits more important than making sure regular people are taken care of? I mentioned earlier, people with disabilities. Most of them have not had access to even that one-time emergency benefit of $600. And, Mr. Speaker, it makes a dramatic difference in a person's life to get that $600. I've had a constituent tell me that they weren't able to get medication for a number of months with the $600 they did receive. They were able to get their medication for the first time in months. Now, Mr. Speaker, when you think that most of the people with disabilities suffering with the same type of financial challenges through this pandemic weren't able to receive even that one-time payment, you can understand that there has to be higher priorities than allowing Canada's billionaires to increase their wealth by tens of billions of dollars and allowing Canada's banks to reap the profits they have during this pandemic and to have the web giants not pay $1 in corporate tax. That's why the priorities of the government really do not seem to be in conjunction with what most Canadians are feeling through this pandemic. Alors, Monsieur le Président, c'est vraiment une question.
So, Mr. Speaker, it's really a question of billions for billionaires. And when you look at this economic update, there's just crumbs for ordinary Canadians compared to the needs they have. And the wealth tax, the tax on excessive profits, the fact that the web giants are not required to pay corporate tax the impact of tax havens and money laundering, which we see happening all across the country, and the fact that the government still refuses to create a public register of effective beneficiaries so that we could put an end to this money laundering. Instead of investing where investments should have been made with a different approach under this economic update, there were options like pharmacare, which there have been voices calling for all across the country. The fact is that pharmacare is extremely essential, and we see that now on the way out of this pandemic, people's huge needs for a pharmacare program. And childcare, the whole question of the daycare network. This is something that comes up over and over again, but that isn't really addressed adequately in this statement. And affordable housing. And we see the need in these times, Mr. Speaker. So many Canadians are struggling. They're having a really hard time getting and keeping affordable housing because there's a lack of affordable housing all across the country. And some people say, well, it's not that serious. Well, let me just point to all the cuts under the Paul Martin government. Those cuts are still having repercussions today on the lack of affordable housing in Canada. And of course, the climate emergency. It may cost up to $20 billion. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has done some forecasting, and that should come out in the next few weeks. But we're talking already around about $13 billion plus $5 billion for corporate takeovers with Trans Mountain, but the corporate sector didn't want anything to do with Trans Mountain. But this is a context where the government is prepared to pay any price. The sky's the limit. Even if the private sector didn't think that this project was profitable. And we also know that the impact on the climate emergency will be huge. So these are not small decisions. It's a whole list of decisions. And eventually it's Canadians who are going to have to pay the price for these bad decisions. The choice is very clear. You have to choose based on people's needs rather than constantly choosing on the side of companies that are making huge profits and billionaires. They shouldn't be given the priority. And on this side of the House, we're against the idea that, oh, you can't touch the wealthy, you can't tax their wealth, you can't touch the web giants, they shouldn't have to pay even corporate tax like everyone else pays in this country, and that the Liberals feel they should forge ahead with Trans Mountain at any cost. The sky's the limit. Even though the private sector didn't want to touch that project with a 10-foot pole, it's taxpayers who are footing the bill. And that's why we say this is an extremely disappointing economic update. We have a government that has refused to see clearly, to invest where it's needed. They've failed also to look to the revenue side because the PBO was very clear on this. He said you have to either cut services to people or increase services and increase revenues. Here we see there's a huge
something about that. It's been commitments that have been made over a quarter century on pharmacare that we still do not see and have in place a universal pharmacare program that provides support for everybody. 90% of Canadians support universal, publicly administered pharmacare in this country, Mr. Speaker. So we're talking about a broad public consensus. Why is that? Well, because we know that there are hundreds of Canadians that die every year because we don't have universal publicly administered pharmacare. We know as well that there's 1 million Canadians that are trying to pay for their medication now in a pandemic, and they have to make those desperate choices between putting food on the table, heating their home, or paying for their medication. Mr. Speaker, in a country as wealthy as Canada, for anybody to be forced to be in that position is simply irresponsible governance. When a government puts a person in that position, it's a government who is neglecting that person's basic needs. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, as you're well aware, what pharmacare brings is a huge cost savings to Canadians. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, again, independent, nonpartisan officer of Parliament, and all of his reports and the reports of his team are well worth MPs reading. Says that we would save $4 billion overall as Canadians. Businesses would save about $6 billion. Individuals who are paying now for medication out of their pocket would save about $5 billion. So what this economic update should have announced, instead of the direction that the government took, is to say, we're moving to get pharmacare in place now. And so we are going to actually put in place the steps that are needed. We're going to sit down with the provinces. We already have an NDP bill, Bill C-213, as you know, Mr. Speaker, that is coming up for a vote in February. We've seen thousands of Canadians writing to their members of Parliament, urging them to support C-213, which is the legal framework for universal publicly administered pharmacare. This government should have said, well, look, we're going to sit down with the provinces now because we understand from this pandemic it is time that we actually put in place a universal pharmacare program in this country. It's long overdue. It should have happened at the beginning. Back 50 years, the cost to Canadians has been enormous ever since. But now that we've got a bill that would actually set the legal framework, let's sit down with the provinces, let's negotiate the financial framework, and let's make sure that pharmacare becomes a reality in 2021. That should have been in the economic update. What should have been in the economic update is a real commitment to childcare, Mr. Speaker, and childcare advocates across the country know how important childcare is for our economic prosperity. The reality is, as you know, Mr. Speaker, for every dollar invested in national childcare, we actually get about $6 in economic stimulus that comes out of that. It is probably the best investment a country can make. And countries that have universal childcare programs know, with the participation of families, women in the workplace, that there is a huge economic boom that happens when you make those investments in childcare. Tragically, Mr. Speaker, in this economic update, the government just basically draws the line on the next steps that should have been phase 2 around national childcare. They basically stop at phase 1 and they say that's enough. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, the reality is you've got Canadian families that are spending up to $2,000 a month per child because there is no childcare. And so we need to turn that around and put in place a childcare program. We already know from childcare advocates the investments that are needed. The investment next spring would need to be $2 billion plus. The government is not even providing half of that amount and basically freezing it at an amount that is well below what is needed for national childcare. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you from a constituent named Michelle, who works with her family, with her children, trying to find a childcare space has been a real struggle. And she's been able to get sort of an ability to substitute in with a local childcare that is full up. She's able sometimes to have her child have access to it. But like so many other families across the country, struggling with childcare costs of up to $2,000 per child, they see that this needs to happen. It is surprising to me that the government has not taken the opportunity in looking to build back better, to build into the framework. So coming into 2021, with pharmacare, universal pharmacare, with a national child care plan. We would be looking to build back better, Mr. Speaker, but to do that, you need to establish the revenue foundation. You need to put into place those measures that I spoke about earlier. You can't keep giving $25 billion away to overseas tax havens. You can't refuse to put in place a wealth tax and excess profits tax when billionaires have increased their wealth during the pandemic by $53 billion. You can't, if you don't put in place the revenue foundation, what it leads to, as the Paul Martin government found out, is austerity and cuts, Mr. Speaker. And when you look at the fine print of this document, you see that once we get past the spring, the government intends to dramatically decrease the amount of supports that are going to regular Canadians. That should give everybody pause, because that's exactly what happened under when Paul Martin was finance minister, and when we saw the cuts to the National Housing Program eradicated for a generation. And we continue to deal with the fallout of those cuts. Well, Mr. Speaker, as well, we have to deal with the climate emergency. We have the pandemic and the climate emergency occurring at the same time. And so for the government to make these massive investments, up to $20 billion, in ramming through Trans Mountain, when Indigenous people have raised huge concerns, when there is a variety of very legitimate criticism of the government in this regard, that the government can't pretend to be working on the climate emergency when it builds a massive pipeline that will undercut anything else that it does. And so this economic update should have made an announcement that the government's not going to pour more money into Trans Mountain, the $20 billion. Instead, that what they are going to do, what they should have been announcing, is a shift to clean energy. And that $20 billion could be used to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. In the clean energy industries, we know in the United States, with the change in government, what most recent projections indicate is that the clean energy sector will increase quadruple over the next 10 years. Canada could be positioned to take advantage of that if the federal government worked with the provinces on clean energy production and ensuring clean energy investment. But instead, federal government, this Liberal government, is building a pipeline, Mr. Speaker. It makes no sense. And it means that the direction the government is taking in this document is simply not sustainable. Issues like affordable housing and that investment, the affordable housing and the right to housing that the NDP brought just a couple of weeks ago to this House, are fundamental. Ensuring that the needs of Indigenous communities are met are fundamental. And yet, what we see from this government is an approach that prioritizes the needs of wealthy Canadians and Canada's most profitable corporations over the needs of Canadians from coast to coast to coast. This is what is most disappointing about this economic update. There are some measures that I think we could all say we can support. Those measures are all below what is required in this time of a pandemic and at a time when so many Canadians are suffering and so many Canadians want to see a difference in this country, a country that has neglected, with a federal government that has neglected quite often so many fundamental issues, whether it's the climate emergency, the needs of Indigenous communities, the need for affordable housing, putting in place pharmacare, putting in place national child care. Those are all legitimate needs that have not been met for years. And yet the government continues to prioritize other things. And the result of that, Mr. Speaker, is something that I think Canadians will say, particularly when they read the fine print, this is not the direction that we want to see going forward. So, Mr. Speaker, what would the NDP have been announcing today if we'd been making this economic update? What would we be saying? Well, course, we would be talking about the programs that we would have put into place over the course of the last few months. I would say, Mr. Speaker, we would very clearly have taken a better approach in terms of the pandemic. Some of the suggestions and some of the things we pushed and fought for and negotiated on are in place during this pandemic. Some are not as well. And Mr. Speaker, some of the things that are absolutely fundamental to us. First off, with people with disabilities months ago, we would have already been seeking to get the provinces on board to make sure that that payment, the pandemic payment that went out to people with disabilities, went to every single person with a disability across the country. We would have made absolutely sure of that. It would have meant a couple of months of preparation work, but it would have made a difference. There is no doubt, Mr. Speaker. For the rent relief program that we have pushed and prodded the government to bring to bear, we would be making it retroactive for all those businesses that simply could not afford or access the program when it was originally set up. We would be making sure that those businesses retroactively could take advantage of that. And Mr. Speaker, we would be making sure that the many holes that we saw through the pandemic response were actually filled. That is an effort that we undertook, Mr. Speaker, as you're well aware. When we saw the government leaving holes, we fought back and negotiated and fought and pushed to make sure as many holes as possible were filled. But we would have taken the approach that everybody matters and we should not be leaving anybody behind. For this economic update today, we would have been announcing that we are putting in place the adequate funding for the next stage in the National Child Care Program. And we would have made sure that that funding was available so that we could see, Canadian parents could see, and Canadian families could see the next stage of child care funding being put into place, that National Child Care Program seeing the light. If it was up to us, Mr. Speaker, today, we would have said that no more money for oil and gas subsidies. What we need to do is focus on the climate emergency. And we won't be spending $20 billion on Trans Mountain. We'll be making sure that money as well goes to ensure clean energy development and jobs. We'd be investing in Indigenous communities. We'd be making sure that the shortchanging that has been has created so much suffering and so many crises in Indigenous communities was ended, and the supports were in place for healthcare, for housing, for clean water. All of those things would have been making sure that today we're announcing an affordable housing program that ensured the right to housing, and that we could put into place something that means within a short time period, Mr. Speaker, we actually end the homelessness crisis that we're seeing in our country and that has been aggravated by the pandemic. We would have been making sure that we pay for these things, Mr. Speaker, by putting into place the revenue measures that I mentioned earlier. An excess profits tax, like we had in the Second World War, because Canadian governments understood the importance of actually making sure that when we're all in this together, that everybody pays their fair share. We would have made sure that there was in place a wealth tax. So Canada's billionaires, with their $53 billion in additional wealth during this pandemic, paid their fair share. We would have made sure as well that the web giants, that they actually pay their fair share of corporate tax, instead of taking the windfall profits they've made during this pandemic and simply being able to do whatever they want with it. And we would be, in this economic update, ensuring the legislative tools to crack down on overseas tax havens, something that costs us $25 billion every year and that Canadians simply can't afford. We would have been building a country where everybody matters and where nobody left behind, Mr. Speaker. We would have taken a different approach on this economic update. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I have a passion for a national pharmacare program, as I know many of my, if not all of my Liberal colleagues have on this side of the House, and we're very happy with the degree in which we've been moving on that front virtually since we've been in government, and a number of things have been set into procedure, and we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully it'll be sooner as opposed to later. But my question to the member is more so in regards to helping me out better understand something. When I was in opposition in the Manitoba legislature, I sat while the NDP were in government. And budget after budget, on several times, they decreased corporate tax. Even when I challenged them on why are they decreasing corporate tax, but they decreased it. Now I hear here in Ottawa, the NDP are advocating the very opposite. They're saying, go heavy on corporate tax. I wonder if he could explain why it is he believes the NDP at the provincial level decreased corporate tax when the national NDP seem to say, no, we should be increasing corporate tax.
The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member asked this question knowing full well that Canada has the reputation of having the most porous tax system for corporate profits among all industrialized countries. In fact, we're also known as the snow-washing capital of the world for those who make illegal money and want to basically money launder it here in Canada because of these porous legislative tools that the government has always refused to provide to CRA. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you're well aware, the Canada Revenue Agency came to the Finance Committee a few months ago, and when asked why nobody who has involved in the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, the Bahama Papers, all notorious tax haven tax evaders, why none of them have been prosecuted, and CRA said after 5 years, the Liberal government has not provided us with the legislative tools, not one legislative tool that we actually see. So the CRA has said they don't have the tools to actually prosecute what is massive tax evasion. The PBO has told us it's $25 billion in tax dollars every year that we lose. And so my question back to the honourable member from Winnipeg North is why, with all those facts, him being well aware of all those facts, he's a very educated man, why has the Liberal government steadfastly, in the last 5 years, refused to take action to crack down on overseas tax havens, to put in place a wealth tax, even to put in place an excess profits tax? Why, with the Liberal government, do billionaires always come before people?
In comments, questions et commentaires, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. He mentioned pharmacare, and we know that the Liberals have been promising pharmacare forever, and it's still not in the economic update. And there were other things like that in the economic update, the 2 billion trees that they were going to plant, and they've not even planted one tree, and they've been saying this for years. And I see that boiled water advisories and fixing those is back in, even though they promised that, you know, in 2015. So it doesn't give me a lot of confidence that the government is actually going to implement any of the stuff that was in the economic update. Does the member share my skepticism?
The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Well, thank you for the question. Do I share the skepticism? Supply management. This time the Liberals say, oh, this time we're really going to do it. We're going to provide support to the supply managed sector. For boiled water advisories, this time Liberals say we're really going to do it. This time, the other times we were kidding. This time it's really, really going to happen. Pharmacare, absolutely nothing new in this economic update, but Liberals said, and in the text it is, yes, here it is. Yes, Liberals promised this time we're really, really going to do it. I mean, Liberals have broken promises for 5 long years. This economic update tells us that this time they actually mean the things that before they have broken as promises. I hope it's the case in at least those 3 areas, but there are many, many other broken promises that I don't think Canadians will forgive them for having broken yet again.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Rosemont.
The honourable member for Rosemont, La Petite Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech. I have many important points to make, especially when it comes to tax havens and tax evasion. There is so much missing from this economic update. It's so disappointing. For example, we're smack dab in the middle of a pandemic, but there's nothing about healthcare, dental care, health transfers to provinces. Then the air travel industry, the aerospace industry, we're told to wait because there might be something for them later. My colleague talked about collecting revenue where we can. I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say about that. The government is going to collect GST on taxable sales of web companies, but as of next January, and we're told that maybe web giants will remit taxes in January 2022. So this gives them 13 months. And then the finance minister says that they will pay these taxes, if necessary, in 2022. The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague, the member for Rosemont, La Petite Patrie. He has really hit the nail on the head with his question. When it comes to web giants, they will not be bound by any obligations. The government is not making any firm commitments. The government has been making promises for 5 years now, and now we're told that web giants might have to remit taxes or pay corporate taxes, maybe at some point. Meanwhile, Canadians are trying to put food on the table for their families or trying to purchase essential medication. Canadians need support, relief, and they're receiving some, sure, but not a lot. Liberals are signaling that these aid programs and packages will end at some point next year. Meanwhile, web giants are given 13 months, 2 years to pay corporate taxes. That is so disappointing. We need to ensure that billionaires and web giants pay their fair share.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to have an issue when the language is switched from French to English. I don't hear you're announcing me at all. I'll have to talk to IT about that. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Burnaby New Westminster for his speech. I agree with a lot of what he has to say. We need to close tax loopholes. We need to tax the billionaires. We need to deal with these web giants and proper taxation for them. That's how we're going to pay for these programs that we want. Universal pharmacare, childcare, taking care of our citizens with programs like a guaranteed livable income. And I agree with him 100% about this pipeline that was purchased, the Trans Mountain, and what a waste of money that is when we're dealing with a climate emergency. My question is about funding that the federal government has put into another pipeline project, the Coastal GasLink project, and LNG Canada, which is to export fracked gas for a number of multinational corporations. There's nothing Canadian about LNG Canada. It's a bunch of foreign multinationals that are getting huge tax breaks from the NDP government in British Columbia, but also from this federal government. And I'd like to know whether he agrees with that, or whether we should just ban fracking and put an end to this climate-destroying process of energy extraction. Thank you.
Well, member for New Westminster, in 50 seconds or less, please.
50 seconds or less, Mr. Speaker. That's a very complex and important question. I mean, what I've said all along about Trans Mountain, what the member for Burnaby South, the NDP caucus, has said is $20 billion is something that is simply not justifiable on any grounds. And that money needs to be focused on clean energy. We do not believe in oil and gas subsidies. And at the federal level, the reality is if we stop putting money into oil and gas companies, and we start putting money into clean energy, we're going to see energy workers, and I'm one of them myself, as you know, Mr. Speaker, a former refinery worker from Burnaby, BC at the Shelburne Oil Refinery. We will see energy workers being able to work in the clean energy sector. What we have from this federal government is no action at all. They simply refuse to make the investments in clean energy that are necessary for a transition, and we believe that should be the priority.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by recognizing that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of WSÁNEĆ peoples, and I am honored to represent Saanich Gulf Islands and to the WSÁNEĆ indigenous peoples of this land. Haishka Siam. I am also going to apologize to my friends, my francophone friends. Je veux parler toujours un peu en français.
I will speak in French a bit, but the issue is that every time you switch languages, you lose a little bit of speaking time. That's why I tend to speak only in English. So I'll be speaking English today. Apologies.
That's the amount of time you lose to change the channel. So I wanted to apologize to francophone friends. The somber news received during the time of today's speech, I want to acknowledge that from the moment when our Honourable Minister for Finance stood to present where we are as a country right now, in British Columbia, Dr. Bonnie Henry presented the somber news that we had a new record broken this weekend. 46 British Columbians died. That's a new record. And over the weekend, we have 2,364 new cases. Records were also broken in Alberta. So I take to heart very much what our Honourable Minister of Finance, the Deputy Prime Minister of this country, said. This is a hard time. COVID is in a second wave and it is surging. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we have to try to work together. We have to hold on, which we seem to have already lost in this Parliament, a sense that we're all in it together and that Canadians want to see us working together. I also want to acknowledge that a bit of history was made today. And that is, as the first woman to take the floor to deliver a speech since the Minister of Finance did, I acknowledge my friend from the bloc from Pontigny got to put forward a question, but as the first woman to deliver a speech since the Honourable Finance Minister, I want to acknowledge that this is the first time in Canadian history that a finance minister has presented an economic update and that finance minister is a woman. It happens that our first female finance minister also delivered her speech to the highest number of women members of Parliament. With the two recent by-elections, we are now 100 women out of 338 members. Not enough, mind you, but a historic breakthrough. And it's in a spirit of knowing that women believe we can accomplish more when we work together that I want to acknowledge the recent leadership on a number of files of the new leader of the Green Party of Canada. As luck would have it, and I certainly wish that there were more women leaders of other federal political parties, but Annamie Paul has replaced me as the Green Party leader, and yet again, the only woman leader at the federal level. And Annamie Paul, in Green values tradition, has been on the COVID front saying we have to work together. We can't allow this to become partisan. And I know it has already become quite partisan in the House of Commons, and I would urge my colleagues from all sides of the House to put Canadians first and to recognize that we can score points off each other later. For now, let's try to work together and keep the volume a little lower out of respect for people who are across this country afraid of catching COVID, afraid of older relatives catching COVID. In my case, as my daughter teaches school in the Burnaby school system, I pay particular attention to an economic statement that says we'll get more and better ventilation in our public spaces because I remain worried. I want to reference another very wise woman before I turn to the details of the speech, and that's Margaret Atwood. And it's one of the themes in our debates in Parliament. It's a theme really that runs through the Finance Minister's fall economic statement. And that's this question of whether in a COVID emergency, we can also be cognizant of a climate emergency. Margaret Atwood was asked this summer in a virtual speech she was giving to the Union of British Columbia Municipalities if she was concerned that because of COVID, climate crisis had been pushed to the back burner. And Margaret Atwood said words to the effect of, well, I don't know about you, but my stove at home has 2 front burners. So I want to make sure that as we build back better, as we look at economic recovery, we continue to remember that the climate emergency hasn't gone away. And we must ensure that every step we take is consistent with the kind of action we take as grown-ups in a climate emergency who recognize that nothing has gotten better while we turn our attention to COVID. Now, looking at the fall economic statement, I have to say it predicts in some ways the path forward, and it gives us some quite substantial hints about what we may see in the next budget. We don't know when the next budget will be, but clearly there's been a lot of hard work going on here. I did mean to say this earlier, forgive me. Everybody's been working very hard. I just want to acknowledge that. In Finance Canada, they've been working very hard. I think Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, Bloc, all of us as members of Parliament have been working very hard, but goodness knows so is the civil service. So have the people, whether their efforts are inadequate or not as we judge them today, who've been securing vaccines for Canadians, who've been securing PPE, who've been trying to figure out how we pay for this, how we fund it, how we go forward. I just want to stop and acknowledge everyone's hard work, and I want to thank the Minister of Finance for hers. Now, where we are here now and what needs to be done better. Certainly, I am very pleased to see that we may, in fact, at long last, and as the Minister of Finance's speech noted, there's been a generation of waiting for a decent childcare. Maybe the fact that the Minister of Finance has had to stay home and take care of her own sick children, we might, in fact, finally get to a proper support in this country for early learning and childcare. But we are told we can see something in budget 2021. We will not be satisfied with less than a full program for childcare for Canadians. But I'm feeling more optimistic than I did before I heard the speech. I am pleased that we saw recognition in this speech of the huge amount of work that needs to be done on reconciliation. A reference to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry and to meeting some of those calls for action is important. We need to meet all the calls for action. We certainly are looking at improvements in contact tracing and testing. We need to do more and better to make sure that we can, at-home testing would be great. Quicker results would be great. And I note this on the vaccine front, and I hope this is offered in the spirit, it's offered in the spirit for sure of collaborative and practical thinking about where we are on vaccines. Angus Reid polling tells us that 39% of Canadians say they want the vaccine as soon as it's ready. 38% say they'd like to wait and see. People want to make sure that it's tested and safe and can be used safely. I'd like to encourage the government to think about vaccines in relation to making sure that we all agree who the frontline workers are, who needs to get it first. That we recognize that it wouldn't be a really wise global course for Canada to hog all the vaccines so every Canadian is vaccinated before, say, frontline healthcare workers in other countries. We need to take a sensible approach and make sure the vaccine is rolled out and that those who are in the front lines get it first, and that we recognize that we're all working together to ensure safety and reliability in the vaccines that are delivered. I hear concerns from my constituents on both sides of this, those who want it quickly and those who say, wait a minute, I want to make sure it's tested properly. I'm very encouraged to hear more for youth in this budget. We let our youth down badly last summer. We need to increase the number of summer jobs. as is promised in this speech. And we're very encouraged to see, as my honorable colleague, the member from Fredericton, asked in the House, I think just a few days ago, will the government agree that we should at least eliminate interest charges on student debt? It's very encouraging to see that that will be done for 1 year, but let's keep doing it. And let's work towards abolishing tuition and giving our kids a good start in life without emerging with massive student debts, which unfortunately remains the case for so many of our young people. We can do better for our youth. I was also really pleased to see the references to more pharmacare development, but it's very slow. We need to see a full pharmacare plan, and we need to see it soon. It was encouraging to see a recognition that the natural course of market share between fossil fuels and renewables, the economic statement notes that the shift that was occurring before COVID hit, we were already seeing a massive shift of investment away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. This economic statement confirms that that shift is happening, that the oil sector is not likely to recover, that the share of renewable energy as affordable and reliable is only going to increase. This is good and encouraging news and should underpin where we go when we look at measures related to climate. So let me turn my attention now to the other emergency, to the climate emergency. You know, since COVID hit, there have been more than 100 climate disasters around the world that have collectively claimed 410,000 lives around the world from climate disasters at a time that, more than 1,400,000 roughly have died of COVID. But the climate disasters and the climate emergency will continue apace, and there is no vaccine against a climate emergency. We need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and do so very quickly. So I was encouraged to see so much that really emerges from green strategy and Green Party policy, but really I'm optimistic when I see the commitment to eco-energy retrofits for buildings, for homes. It's described as being for homes. We need to extend it to all buildings. We need to make sure that commercial and institutional buildings can also make these investments in energy efficiency retrofits. They cost less per dollar of carbon averted, and they create more jobs right across the country in all the skilled trades, in carpenters and electricians and in insulating. And it's a fantastic way to invest that builds our economies back at the local level, also helping all of those local hardware and supply for buildings, carpet, all of the elements of eco-energy retrofits builds our local economies. Very encouraged to see better infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles. Yes to tree planting. Yes, please, and please make sure that we're planting in Indigenous species, that we're getting into those areas that have been burned off due to forest fires and are not recovering because the fires burned so hot in areas in the Thompson River Valley and Fraser. We've seen so many, the Elephant Hill fire, for example, in British Columbia, years later is not recovering. We need to plant trees in those areas as part of our strategy to recover and protect our wild salmon. These things are interconnected, and yes, it's a very important way to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. I hope that in the budget we'll also see, because we saw Indigenous peoples referenced as part of tree planting strategies, let's also make sure the Indigenous Guardian programs are expanded and properly funded. Very encouraged to see that peat and grasslands and other parts of the nature-based solutions to the climate crisis are being referenced here. And for the first time, looks like there's going to be substantial money, but it doesn't look like enough, I'll be honest. But farmers are a big part of the climate solution. Regenerative management of our soils, making sure there are crop covers all the time so that the soils don't blow away. This is actually a significant part of carbon sequestration and should be properly funded as a way that helps our farming community at the same time that it reduces greenhouse gases. So that's, it's good to see nature-based solutions playing a role in where the government appears to be going for the future of climate action. Public transit is terribly important. I must note that early reaction from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to this economic statement is that they are disappointed that there's not enough for their budget planning at the municipal level right across Canada. I flag that for the minister and for the government to make sure that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is brought in as a very close partner. They've got solid data. I've always been impressed with their work, and partnering with municipalities has served many federal governments very well. Going back to Stephen Harper's government in 2008, their infrastructure programs were rolled out thanks to our municipal order of government. So we can do more there. But I do want to raise a concern. Almost every reference to public transit that I've seen, and including this financial statement, focuses on urban public transit. We have a crisis in Canada, and it was flagged in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, of a lack of public transportation to get from A to B in rural areas. The loss of Greyhound, the loss of Saskatchewan bus services, the loss throughout the Maritimes of bus service between areas that are more remote is a real crisis. And I hope as we're building back better, we will look in the budget when it comes out next, whatever it's going to come out in 2021, funding to ensure that people in more remote areas have access to affordable, safe public transit. So young Indigenous women and girls don't have to hitchhike. So our seniors don't have to get behind the wheel of a car when they don't want to drive at night because there's no other way to get from A to B. We can do better. I was pleased to see the references to the interties for our electricity grid. It is important, as the financial statement points out, that we go off coal and decarbonize our electricity grid. But just as the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith just mentioned, I want to mention it mentions going off coal, but it doesn't mention that shifting from coal to fracked gas, to burn fracked gas to produce electricity, doesn't produce major savings in greenhouse gases. It's a wash. So we must ban fracking and stop thinking that fracked natural gas plays any role in a solution to the climate crisis. So too, this financial statement mentions nuclear reactors, so-called small and medium reactors, which exist on paper. They're a proposal, a marketing strategy for a dying industry. Don't put good money after bad. We've wasted billions of dollars in this country on a failed nuclear reactor strategy. Calling them small and modular doesn't make them a good place to put money. You should invest in things that per dollar invested reduce the most greenhouse gases and create the most jobs. And if you keep that in mind, and also the shortest amount of time between investment and return, if you keep those three things in mind, you wouldn't put any money in nuclear at all, particularly in something that is a design project on paper and doesn't exist in reality. Now, what else do we need? What else do we need in the next budget? And this has been flagged by a number of colleagues from different parties, particularly the New Democrats and the Greens have mentioned this before, but we need to increase revenue flows. We need to know that we've got the money to continue to have, and I applaud the minister for putting forward that we're going to need at least a 3-year economic stimulus package to bring back our economy. Come on, let's bring in a wealth tax. If there's the billionaires have made $53 billion since the pandemic started. Let's tax that wealth and make sure that Canadians can afford our pharmacare plans, our child care plans, our dental care plans for low-income Canadians, helping our students, taking care of our seniors. We need to have a wealth tax. I've flagged that we need to have a guaranteed livable income. When we look at, and this is referenced in the statement, by the way, I think it's at page 79, there's reference to the fact that so many of our frontline healthcare workers are low income and in precarious jobs. That's just not good enough. There are essential workers. They've been working so hard and risking their lives in long-term care homes. These frontline workers are so low paid, it's just a scandal. Let's look at guaranteed livable income so that we know no one falls below the poverty line and that every worker in Canada keeps what they earn on top of their guaranteed livable income so that they don't face insecurity, housing insecurity, healthcare insecurity. They are protected. So we need to look at guaranteed livable income and bring it into being, as well as pharmacare, as well as childcare, as well as knowing that housing is a right and every Canadian has a roof over their head. We need to look at doing more in taxing the digital giants. It is encouraging what the Minister for Finance said, but as other colleagues have noted, if they're not paying their taxes, just GST and HST, for more than a year, that's not good enough. We need to start regulating and taxing the digital giants, whether they are Airbnbs or Amazon or the Googles that are threatening existing Canadian industries, whether they're small businesses up and down our main streets of our towns, or our newspapers, or our broadcasters. We're starting to recognize the threat, but there's more we must do. Now, I noted it was sort of amusing in the questions and answers. My colleague, the Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith, asked the Leader of the Official Opposition if he had any thoughts on the government's moving towards clean, green energy. And the Leader of the Official Opposition responded, which I guess makes the Conservatives' position clear, that he's really proud of the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, so let me get to this question of fossil fuels and how we're funding them. It's time, it's more than time to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Stephen Harper promised to stop subsidizing fossil fuels in 2009. The Liberals promised it again in their platform in 2015, and fossil fuel subsidies have gone up. One way of ignoring that reality is to have trouble defining what a fossil fuel subsidy is. And Finance Canada told the Auditor General they weren't sure how you would define it. Here's how you define it. Anytime you put public money into producing energy out of fossil fuels and expanding that resource, you are subsidizing fossil fuels, which means stop subsidizing fracking. Stop subsidizing LNG, which is being subsidized by the federal and British Columbia governments, by the way. Stop spending money on pipelines. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is 100% owned by the people of Canada. The minimum expenditure that is now committed is $12 billion. It could be far more than that, as my friend from Burnaby, New Westminster has noted. Cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We'll still own the existing pipeline. No one's worrying about having, well, it was a waste of money to buy it, but it's operating. It brings crude into Burnaby for the last remaining refinery. No problem with that. It'll be phased out over time, but stop putting public money into expanding greenhouse gases. And for heaven's sakes, Prime Minister, pick up the phone, call President-elect Joe Biden and say, good for you for canceling Keystone. It's a good idea. What can we do to put our heads together using, we were very pleased to see it, a border adjustment tax on carbon. Let's put together a continental package of Canada and the US and Mexico together saying we're going to carbon price and we're going to have a border adjustment to protect us from imports from countries that aren't pricing carbon properly. We have an incredible opportunity with an incoming US administration having appointed John Kerry as their climate czar. This appears to be a government that's serious. They're already ahead of us in reducing greenhouse gases, even after 4 years of Trump. That's how poorly we've been performing. Let's seize the opportunity to call President-elect Joe Biden and say, we're with you. Let's cancel all the fossil fuel subsidies and let's both countries ban fracking, because fracked natural gas produces methane, and that methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. And if we're going to preserve a livable world for our kids, we have to keep both issues on the front burner. So I will be digging into this report, as I know Anna-Mee Paul, Green Party leader, and members of our caucus, the member from Fredericton and Nanaimo Ladysmith, will be working through all of the details in this very detailed document. I'm encouraged by much of what we see. I think we will be increasingly clear on what's missing. But please, let's make this the turning point it really can be. Post-COVID, Canada can emerge as a country that actually gets our act together, that becomes where our productivity index goes up, where our competitiveness goes up, where our job creation goes up, because we will not be wasting any more money in dying industries that not only are dying, but threaten us. We have to put our kids and our recovery at the heart of everything we do as a nation. Climate emergency and fairness in the world, eliminating poverty in Canada, eliminating racism in Canada, and taking a stand globally so that we help around the world delivering on all the sustainable development goals. We can do this. We've got a really amazing opportunity, and I plead with all my colleagues to think of this as a moment where we stop thinking about question period as how can I make the other guy look bad, but how do we together make Canada look good? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the former leader of the Green Party can never be accused of not being bold. And I always appreciate to the degree in which she's very forthright in terms of her opinions. And, you know, on the issue of whether it's the pipelines or fracking, very much understand, disagree in part with what the member is saying, but I understand what she's saying and why she is saying it. And the question that I have for her is in regards to the LNG project. If she could, what would she do with that specific project, given where it's at today? She talks about the negative impacts of fracking. I don't quite understand what she would do with LNG today if, in fact, she had the power to do something on it.
Honourable member, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should wait to be called upon. To my honourable friend from Winnipeg, it's the liquefied natural gas is, when it comes from conventional natural gas, a viable alternative. And we used to call it a transition fuel when I was back in Sierra Club in the early 1990s. Nobody in the environmental movement calls it a transition fuel anymore, because what we're dealing with is not conventional natural gas. We are fracking. Fracked natural gas has the same carbon footprint as coal. So it represents a major lie to tell British Columbians, for instance, as our premier tells us, that this is going to be wonderful because they'll burn it in China instead of coal, and that will somehow help. The global atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon comes from. Carbon from fracking and the methane that's released does just as much damage to the atmosphere as burning coal in China. Cancel it and put our money where we and the fact that this is being heavily subsidized for a group of foreign corporations is a scandal. Most of the manufacturing, by the way, is taking place in the People's Republic of China to build what will then be shipped over to British Columbia. Cancel it. It's a massive subsidy for jobs in the People's Republic of China. Let's put the jobs in Canada and produce renewable energy here.
Questions and comments. Question and commentaire. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just was wondering if the former leader of the Green Party could clarify something for me. Earlier tonight, the member from Port Nanaimo, Ladysmith, said that he was excited about the geothermal drilling activity that happened in Saskatchewan that resulted in a gusher of a well. The thing is, that well was actually drilled using fracking. So we just heard her talk about how much she has a disdain for fracking, but yet her colleague was talking glowingly about a well that was actually drilled using fracking. So what is it? Do you support fracking or do you not?
Again, I want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the Speaker, not directly to each other. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I'm glad to have the question for the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands. Let's be clear: when you're fracking you're fracturing the bedrock for natural gas, and you're actually fracking the gas, vast amounts of methane are released, but there are transferable skills. People who drilled wells for oil can drill wells for geothermal, and that's what happened here. This is a huge find. It's really important to recognize actually 10% of all the abandoned wells through Saskatchewan and Alberta have potential to be tapped for geothermal. So let's look at the opportunities transitioning away from fossil fuels and into renewables. Geothermal has huge potential, and those wells at depth, 10% of them that are already abandoned, that are a liability on the books of Saskatchewan and Alberta, actually have potential to produce green electricity. And we support green electricity. We don't support fracking.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her answer to her reply to the economic statement. I believe that she, like the Bloc Québécois, would find that there was a lack of vision in the economic statement. She talked about forestry and carbon capturing and greener energy sources. And I tabled a proposal that involves forestry, which is an economic pillar of the Quebec economy and the Canadian economy. I wonder if that's a promising area. Are there any developments in research? Does she know of anything that is good about forestry for the future? The Honourable Member for Saanich. Yes, I'd like to thank my colleague from Manicouagan. I believe that the Bloc's approach is so close to the Green Party's approach. We need to invest in renewable energy, not in oil pipelines and fossil fuels. And thank you for the question. Questions and comments?
Comments, the Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleague for her speech. We've been talking a lot about some of the disappointing aspects of this economic update, but the most biggest disappointment as far as I'm concerned, and she's been talking about bold actions that need to be taken, is that this federal government is not stepping up on what has been immense levels of profit and increase in wealth during this pandemic. Billionaires have received about $53 billion in new wealth in Canada. We've seen the web giants making a huge level of profits, and they don't pay corporate taxes. So my question to the Honourable Member is very simple. Does she feel it's important that the federal government actually take measures to increase revenues so that we're not in a situation where the federal government then cuts supports that are vitally needed for people because they haven't put in place the revenue side of the equation?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thanks to my friend from New Westminster Burnaby. Actually, I referenced the same figure in my speech. The fact that the billionaire class has raked in another $53 billion since COVID began is a shocker. We do need a wealth tax. We also, I think we should look at the profits of the large commercial banks. Our large commercial banks are taxed less in Canada than in some of the competitor nations, such as in the United States. So we're looking at the banks have had record profits. The billionaires have had record profits. Goodness knows the digital companies, as we approach Christmas season, we endorse, the campaign not to buy anything from Amazon, because those big offshore digital giants are eroding our bedrock small businesses across Canada, whether they're hotels affected by Airbnbs or newspapers affected by the news services where they don't even pay for what they're getting. So I'm very much in favor of us looking at future revenue sources, and let's continue to push the Minister of Finance. At some point, we have to find a new source of revenue. We can't imagine going through the kind of austerity programs that I remember, and that I know he remembers from the early 90s, when we lost something like 30% of our hospital beds in a misguided approach to cut spending, and it really hurt us long term. So we have to be prepared to find other sources of revenue so that we can keep building the kind of society that we know we can. We're a wealthy country. We just have to get our priorities right.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, having given me the opportunity on the last question for tonight. The question to the honourable former leader of the Green Party is, I've never heard her talk about nuclear energy or nuclear producing energy as a solution toward more greener or to reduce gas emissions. I would like to hear her comment on this specific topic. Thank you.
Honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
You know, I think the nuclear promise for Canada was best summed up years ago by commentator Fred Nelman, who said nuclear is a future technology whose time has passed. There is no future for nuclear as part of our solution to the climate crisis. It's very capital intensive. It is not labor intensive. It reduces very few greenhouse gases compared to the big winners, which are, of course, energy efficiency investments, renewable energy investments, outpace nuclear so clearly that you'd only put money in nuclear if you were deluded and addicted to the technology. And I'm afraid there's still some people in Natural Resources Canada who fall in that category.
It being 7:30 p.m., pursuant to order made on Wednesday, November 25th, 2020, the House stands adjourned until Tuesday, December 1st, 2020 at 10 a.m., pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.